Somewhere inside the fortified walls of Yale University's Voynich rare book and manuscript library, behind layers of climate-controlled glass and under the watchful gaze of security systems designed to protect some of the most valuable written artifacts in human history, there sits a small, unassuming book. It is roughly 9 inches tall, 6 inches wide, and just over an inch thick. Its vellum pages are worn and soft, their edges rounded by centuries of handling. Its cover, a simple and unremarkable binding, gives no indication of what lies within. If you were walking through the library and did not know what you were looking at, you might pass right by it. You might mistake it for any number of medieval texts that fill the shelves of great libraries across Europe and beyond. You might assume it was a book of prayers, a medical treatise, a farmer's almanac, or a monk's diary. You would have no reason to stop, no reason to look twice. But this book is none of those things, or perhaps it is all of them. No one knows, no one has ever known. And despite more than a century of sustained effort by some of the most brilliant minds humanity has ever produced, including world-class linguists, military codebreakers who cracked enemy ciphers in the deadliest wars the world has ever seen, computer scientists armed with artificial intelligence algorithms capable of processing billions of data points per second, historians, botanists, astronomers, and obsessive amateur sleuths who have devoted their entire adult lives to this single puzzle, no one has ever been able to read a single confirmed word of this book. It is known as the Voynich Manuscript, and it is, without exaggeration, the most mysterious document in the history of the written word. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. This is not a story about a dusty old book. This is a story about the very nature of knowledge, about the boundaries of human understanding, about whether there exist ideas and systems of thought so foreign to our modern minds that we cannot even begin to comprehend them. It is a story about obsession, about deception, about the tantalizing possibility that someone created something so profoundly unusual that 500 years of human progress have not been enough to unlock its secrets. The Voynich Manuscript is catalogued as MS 408 at the Voynich Library. It contains approximately 240 pages, though scholars believe that some pages have been lost over the centuries. Every single page is filled with text, written in an elegant, flowing script that resembles no known alphabet in any language, living or dead. The letters, if that is even the correct word for them, are graceful and consistent, written with the confidence and fluidity of someone who clearly knew what they were writing, someone who had practiced this script many times before. There are no obvious corrections. There are no crossed-out words. There are no signs of hesitation or uncertainty in the hand of the writer. Whoever wrote this book did so with purpose and conviction, but the text is only part of the mystery. The Voynich Manuscript is lavishly illustrated with hundreds of drawings that are, to put it mildly, deeply strange. There are plants that do not exist in any known botanical catalog. There are astronomical diagrams that seem to depict the movements of celestial bodies, but correspond to no recognized system of astronomy. There are drawings of naked women bathing in pools of green liquid, connected by elaborate networks of tubes, and are circular diagrams covered in symbols and divided into segments in ways that suggest zodiacal or calendrical systems, but match nothing that any historian has ever been able to identify with certainty. There are what appear to be pharmaceutical recipes, with drawings of roots and herbs alongside blocks of the same unreadable text. The images are colorful, often bizarre, and rendered in a style that is obviously primitive and sophisticated. Some scholars have described them as the work of a gifted amateur, someone with a clear artistic vision but limited formal. Others have argued of the illustrations is that they are stylized rep of real thing that was meant to obscure their true identity. Still others have suggested that the images depict things that simply do not exist in our world, things imagined, hallucinated, or imported from a reality that we cannot access. For more than 100 years, the Voynich Manuscript has resisted every attempt at decipherment. It has broken the minds and hearts of brilliant people. It has spawned thousands of theories, ranging from the plausible to the absurd. It has been called the Holy Grail of cryptography, the most studied and least understood document in existence, and the single greatest unsolved mystery in the history of linguistics. Some have declared it a meaningless hoax, an elaborate medieval prank designed to fool a wealthy buyer into paying a fortune for a book full of gibberish. Others have argued that it contains genuine knowledge, perhaps alchemical secrets, lost herbal remedies, or spiritual insights recorded in a language that was deliberately made impenetrable to protect its contents from the uninitiated. And then there are those who believe that the Voynich Manuscript is something else entirely, something that our current frameworks of understanding are simply not equipped to explain. Something that suggests the existence of knowledge systems, perhaps even civilizations, that have been completely erased from the historical record. Something that might, if it could ever be read, fundamentally change our understanding of what human beings knew and were capable of centuries before the modern era. To understand the Voynich Manuscript, we must first understand how it came to the attention of the modern world. And that story begins, as so many stories of great discoveries do, with a man who was searching for something valuable in a place where most people would never think to look. His name was Wilfrid Michael Voynich. He was born in 1865 in a town called Telšiai, which was then part of the Russian Empire and is now located in modern-day Lithuania. Voynich was a remarkable figure by any measure. As a young man, he became involved in revolutionary politics, opposing the rule of the Russian Tsar. He was arrested and imprisoned in Warsaw, and later escaped and made his way across Europe, eventually settling in London, where he reinvented himself as a rare book dealer. He married Ethel Lillian Boole, the daughter of the famous mathematician George Boole, whose work on logic and binary systems would later become foundational to computer science. Ethel herself was a novelist and political activist, and the couple moved in intellectual circles that included some of the most prominent thinkers and writers of their era. Wilfrid Voynich had an extraordinary eye for rare and valuable manuscripts. He traveled extensively, visiting monasteries, private collections, and estate sales across Europe, always searching for forgotten treasures. He understood that the greatest finds were often hiding in plain sight, buried in collections that their owners did not fully understand or appreciate. He knew that a single overlooked manuscript, correctly identified and authenticated, could be worth a fortune. In 1912, Voynich made the discovery that would define his legacy and attach his name permanently to one of history's greatest mysteries. He was visiting the Villa Mondragon, a grand Renaissance estate near the town of Frascati, just outside Rome in what is now the Italian Republic. The villa was being used as a Jesuit college, and the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, was in financial difficulty. To raise funds, the Jesuits were quietly selling off portions of their vast library, a collection that had been assembled over centuries and included manuscripts and books of enormous historical significance. Voynich was allowed to examine a collection of manuscripts that had been set aside for potential sale. Among them, he found a small, thick volume with a worn vellum cover. When he opened it, he encountered page after page of text written in a script he had never seen before, accompanied by illustrations unlike anything in his considerable experience with medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. He was immediately captivated. He knew, with the instincts of a man who had spent decades handling rare documents, that he was looking at something truly extraordinary. Voynich purchased the manuscript, along with several other items from the Jesuit collection. The exact price he paid has never been conclusively established, and Voynich himself was deliberately vague about the details of the acquisition, perhaps to protect the Jesuits from criticism for selling valuable holdings, perhaps to maintain his own competitive advantage as a dealer who had discovered something that others had overlooked. Voynich brought the manuscript back to his shop and began trying to learn everything he could about it. Tucked inside the front cover, he found a letter that would become the earliest concrete clue about the manuscript's provenance. The letter was written in Latin, dated 1665 or 1666, and was from a man named Johannes Marcus Marci to a Jesuit scholar named Athanasius Kircher in Rome. Marci was the rector of the University of Prague and a respected physician and scientist. Kircher was one of the most famous intellectuals in Europe, a polymath who studied everything from magnetism and optics to Egyptology and music. He was particularly well known for his attempts to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics, and although his translations were later shown to be largely incorrect, his reputation as a decoder of ancient scripts was formidable during his lifetime. In the letter, Marci explained that he was sending the manuscript to Kircher in the hope that Kircher might be able to read it, since, as Marci wrote, no one else had been able to do so. Marci mentioned that the manuscript had previously been owned by Georg Bersch, a little-known alchemist who had lived in Prague and who had spent years trying and failing to decipher the book. Bersch had also written to Kircher about the manuscript, sending him copies of some of the text and asking. There is no evidence that Kircher ever replied to Bersch or made any progress with the manuscript. After Bersch died, the manuscript passed to Marci, who then sent it to Kircher. The letter also contained one additional tantalizing detail. Marci wrote that, according to a reliable script, had once been purchased by the Holy Roman II for the 600 ducats, ruled from 1576 to 12, and was famous for his passionate interest in science, alchemy, astrology, and the occult. His court in Prague was a magnet for scholars, artists, alchemists, and charlatans from across Europe. If the manuscript truly passed through Rudolph's hands, this would place it firmly in the world of late Renaissance intellectual culture, and would suggest that even in the 16th century, the book was already considered mysterious and valuable enough to command a price that was equivalent to several years' income for a skilled craftsman. Marci also mentioned in his letter that the manuscript was believed to have been the work of Roger Bacon, the famous English friar, philosopher, and early advocate of the scientific method who lived in the 13th century. Bacon was known for his wide-ranging intellectual interests, including optics, alchemy, and linguistics. He had also reportedly created or experimented with ciphers and codes. The attribution to Bacon was not based on any direct evidence, but rather on a tradition or rumor that had apparently accompanied the manuscript for some time. Wilfrid Voynich was excited by this attribution. If the manuscript could be connected to Roger Bacon, a linguistic mystery, but also a major historic, a lost work by one of the most important thinkers of the medieval period. Voynich promoted this theory enthusiastically, and it became one of the dominant narratives surrounding the manuscript for decades. However, as we shall see, later scientific analysis would cast serious doubt on the Roger Bacon attribution and push the manuscript's origins to a later period. After Voynich's death in 1930, the manuscript passed to his widow, Ethel, who kept it until her own death in 1960. She bequeathed it to a close friend, Anne Nill, who had worked as Voynich's assistant for many years. Nill sold the manuscript in 1961 to another rare book dealer named Hans Peter Krauss, who tried unsuccessfully to find a buyer willing to pay the price he believed the manuscript was worth. Eventually, in 1969, Krauss donated the manuscript to Yale University's Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where it has remained ever since, available for examination by scholars and accessible in digitized form to anyone in the world with an internet connection. Now that we understand how the manuscript came to the modern world, let us turn to what is actually in it. Let us open its pages and look at what has baffled humanity for so long. The Voynich manuscript can be roughly divided into several sections based on the types of illustrations that accompany the text. These sections are commonly referred to as the herbal section, the astronomical section, the biological section, the cosmological section, the pharmaceutical section, and the recipe section. These labels are the inventions of modern scholars and may not reflect the original author's intentions, but they provide a useful framework for discussing the manuscript's contents. The herbal section fills rough of the manuscript, page after page of plants, each of text that presumably describe the plant in question. This is, on the surface, not unusual. Herbals, books that catalog plants and their medicinal properties, were extremely common in medieval and early Renaissance Europe. Monasteries maintained herb gardens and produced manuscripts detailing which plants could be used to treat which ailments. Physicians and apothecaries relied on these texts as practical guides. The tradition of herbal medicine stretches back thousands of years, and illustrated herbals were among the most widely copied and circulated types of manuscripts in the medieval world. But the plants depicted in the Voynich Manuscript are not like the plants in any other herbal. That is the problem. The mystery. Researchers have spent decades trying to identify the plants shown in the manuscript, every known species in every known botanical catalog, and the results have been deeply frustrating. Some of the plants bear a vague resemblance to real species. A few have been tentatively identified as sunflowers, water lilies, ferns, or other common plants, but the vast majority depict plants do not exist. Their roots are wrong. Their leaves are the wrong shape. Their flowers have the wrong number of petals. Their overall structure does not correspond to any known genus or family of plants. Some scholars have argued that the plants are stylized representations, that the artist deliberately exaggerated or simplified certain features in ways that make identification difficult, but that the underlying plants are real. Others have suggested that the plants are composites, that the artist combined features from two or more real plants into a single imaginary species, perhaps as a form of encoding or concealment. Suppose that the plants might be real species, or that they are native to a region that European scholars have not traditionally studied, perhaps Central Asia, the New World, or some other location far from the European botanical tradition. But none of these explanations is fully satisfying, and the plants of the Voynich manuscript remain one of its most enduring puzzles. If the manuscript is a genuine herbal, a practical guide to medicinal plants, then the inability to identify those plants renders the entire work useless, no matter what the text says. And if the plants are deliberately invented, then what is the purpose of the book? Why go to the enormous effort of creating an elaborate illustrated herbal if the plants are fictional? The astronomical section follows the and is, if anything, even more bewildering. This section contains circular diagrams that clearly depict celestial objects, the sun, the moon, stars, and what appear to be the signs of the zodiac. Several pages feature large, ornate circles divided into segments, with figures and symbols arranged around them in patterns that suggest astronomical or astrological charts. Astrology and astronomy were closely intertwined in the medieval world. The movements of the planets and stars were believed to influence human health, personality, and destiny. Physicians rooted astrology when diagnosing illness and prescribing. Medical astrology was a serious discipline, taught in universities by respected scholars. An illustrated manuscript that combined herbal medicine with astronomical diagrams would not have been unusual in this context, but once again, the Voynich manuscript's astronomical diagrams do not quite match anything that historians recognize. The zodiac symbols are present, but they are accompanied by figures and labels that do not correspond to any known astrological tradition. Their diagrams appear to depict the orbits of celestial bodies, but the arrangements do not match the geocentric model that dominated medieval astronomy, nor do they match the heliocentric model that would later replace it. The diagrams seem to follow their own internal logic has never been deciphered. One particularly pages in this section features a series of circular diagrams surrounded by what appear to be groups of naked women, each standing in or near a star. The women are small, simply drawn. Their arrangement seems to follow some kind of pattern, but the significance of this pattern has never been determined. Are they symbolic representations of celestial forces? Are they decorative elements with no astronomical meaning at all? No one knows. The biological section is perhaps the strangest part of the entire manuscript. It contains page after page of drawings of nude women, most of them small in scale and rendered with a minimal but distinctive style. The women are shown bathing in or swimming through pools and tubes filled with what appears to be green or blue liquid. The pools are connected to each other by an elaborate network of pipes, channels, and vessels that some have compared to plumbing systems, others to the circulatory system of the human body, and still others to alchemical apparatus. The figures are clearly female, and most are depicted with rounded bellies, which some scholars have interpreted as pregnancy. Others have argued that the rounded bodies are simply the artist's style and do not represent any specific physical condition. The women's expressions are generally neutral or serene. They do not appear to be in distress. They seem to be engaged in some kind of ritual or therapeutic activity, but the nature of that activity is entirely opaque. The biological section has inspired some of the most creative and speculative interpretations of the manuscript. Some suggested that evil understanding of human or embryonic tubes and pools representing the entire body. Others have proposed a bathing or hydrotherapy perhaps connected to a specific cultural or religious tradition. Still others are pure ritual transform chemical the purification. There is no detail in the biological section considered. Pools and channels appear from or flow or resemble organs, been varied as kidneys, chemical. Nature is their presence all impressional section, some kind of success, spiritual imaginary. Etymological is a series of fold-out pages with large circular diagrams that appear to depict maps or cosmological models. These are among the most visually impressive pages in the entire manuscript. Some of the circles contain what seem to be landscapes with castles, towers, roads, and other features. Others contain abstract patterns of circles within circles, connected by lines and filled with text and symbols. These pages have prompted comparisons to medieval mappi mundi, the stylized maps of the world that were common in European monasteries and libraries. Mappi mundi were not intended to be geographically accurate in the modern sense. They were symbolic representations of the world as it was understood through the lens of theology and tradition. The most famous example, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, places Jerusalem at the center of the world and depicts the continents of Europe, Africa, and Asia arranged around it in a schematic fashion. Some scholars have argued that the cosmological diagrams in the Voynich Manuscript represent a similar kind of world picture, perhaps reflecting the cosmological beliefs of the manuscript's creator. Others have suggested that they are maps of specific locations, perhaps the grounds of a monastery, the layout of a city, or the geography of a particular region. Attempts have been made to match the features in the diagram locations, identificationally accepted. One particularly large fold-out page has attracted intense scrutiny. It appears to show a series of interconnected circular forms, some containing small buildings or towers, connected by what look like roads or paths. Some researchers have seen in this page a map of volcanic islands, perhaps in the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. Others have seen a diagram of the cosmos, with the circles representing planetary orbits or celestial spheres. Still others have seen a purely abstract design with no representational meaning at all. The page remains as enigmatic as the rest of the manuscript. The pharmaceutical section contains drawings of what appear to be containers, jars, and vessels, often accompanied by drawings of plant parts, roots, leaves, and flowers. The vessels are arranged in rows, and each is accompanied by a block of text. The overall layout strongly suggests a pharmaceutical catalog, a reference guide listing medicines, their ingredients, and perhaps their uses or methods of preparation. This section is perhaps the most practically oriented part of the manuscript. If the Voynich Manuscript is a genuine medical or scientific text, the pharmaceutical section would be its most directly useful component. A pharmaceutical catalog that listed specific remedies and their ingredients would have been an invaluable resource for a medieval physician or apothecary. But without being able to read the text, the information in this section remains locked away, as inaccessible as if it were written on the surface of the moon. The recipe section, which fills the final pages of the manuscript, contains dense blocks of text arranged in short paragraphs, each marked by a star or bullet point in the left margin. There are very few illustrations in this section, which distinguishes it from the rest of the manuscript. The format strongly resembles a collection of recipes or instructions, and many scholars believe that this section contains practical directions, perhaps for preparing medicines, performing rituals, or out some other type of procedure. The recipe section is significant because it provides one of the strongest arguments that the manuscript is a genuine text rather than a hoax. The text in this section is organized in a way that clearly suggests a functional purpose. The paragraphs are of varying lengths, which is consistent with a collection of instructions for different procedures. The star markers suggest a systematic organization, perhaps alphabetical, chronological, or categorical. If the manuscript were simply random gibberish designed to look like a real text, there would be no reason to organize this section so carefully. Now let us turn to what is perhaps the most important and most frustrating aspect of the Voynich manuscript, the text itself. The script in which the manuscript is written has been given the name Voynichese by modern scholars, and it is unlike any other writing system that has ever been discovered. Voynichese consists of approximately 20 to 30 distinct characters, depending on how one counts them and how one decides to distinguish separate characters from variations of the same character. Some of the characters resemble Latin letters, others resemble Arabic numerals, still others are entirely unique, bearing no resemblance to any known alphabet. The characters are written from left to right, and the text flows in a continuous stream with clear word boundaries marked by spaces. There are no obvious punctuation marks. Paragraphs are sometimes set off by decorative elements, but the text itself flows without breaks. The script is remarkably consistent throughout the manuscript. The same characters appear on every page in every section, and they are written with the same hand, or at most two very similar hands. This consistency has been one of the most important clues for researchers. It tells us that the writer or writers had fully mastered this script and could reproduce it quickly and accurately. This is not the handwriting of someone who was inventing symbols on the fly or copying unfamiliar characters from a reference sheet. This is the handwriting of someone who had internalized this system completely, who could write in it as naturally and fluently as you or I would write in our own native language. Statistical analysis of the text has revealed several remarkable properties. The words in Voynichese follow patterns that are in some ways similar to natural languages and in other ways strikingly different. Certain characters and character combinations appear with predictable frequencies. Some characters appear almost exclusively at the beginnings of words, while others appear only at the ends. Some two-character combinations are extremely common, while others never appear at all. These patterns suggest that Voynichese follows a set of internal rules, a grammar or structure of some kind, but the nature of those rules has never been determined. One of the most important statistical tools that has been applied to the Voynich text is a measure known as Zipf's law. George Kingsley Zipf, This law describes a pattern that is found in virtually every natural language that has ever been studied. In any sufficiently large body of text in any natural language, the most common word will appear approximately twice as often as the second most common word, 3 times as often as the third most common word, and so on. When the frequencies of words are plotted on a graph, they form a characteristic curve that is remarkably similar across all known languages. When researchers applied Zipf's law to the Voynich Manuscript, they found that the text follows this pattern very closely. The word frequencies in Voynichese produce a curve that is virtually indistinguishable from the curves produced by texts in English, Latin, Chinese, Arabic, and every other language that has been tested. This is a powerful piece of evidence. It strongly suggests that the text is not random gibberish. Random sequences of characters do not follow Zipf's law. Nonsensical text generated by a simple mechanical process does not follow Zipf's law. The fact that the Voynich text does follow this law is a strong indicator that it encodes meaningful information, whether in a natural language, an artificial language, or some other system of organized thought. But Zipf's law alone does not tell us what the text means. It tells us only that the text has the statistical properties of meaningful language. It does not tell us which language, or whether the meaning is encoded through a cipher, a code, an unknown language, or some other mechanism that we have not yet imagined. Another statistical property of the Voynich text that has attracted attention is its entropy, a measure of the amount of information contained in each character or word. Natural languages have characteristic entropy values. English, for example, has a relatively high entropy because it has a large alphabet and relatively complex spelling rules. Chinese has a different entropy profile because its writing system works on fundamentally different principles. When researchers measured the entropy of the Voynich text, they found that it falls within the range of natural languages, but that its specific value is lower than most European languages and more similar to certain Asian languages or highly structured artificial languages. This low entropy has been interpreted in different ways. Some researchers have argued that it suggests the text is written in an agglutinative language, one that builds long words by combining smaller meaningful units, such as Turkish, Finnish, or certain indigenous languages. Others have suggested that the low entropy is evidence of a simple substitution cipher applied to a language with relatively low information density. Still others have argued that the low entropy is a sign that the text is not meaningful at all, that it was generated by a process that mimicked some but not all of the properties of natural language. The word structure of Voynichese is also unusual. Words in the manuscript tend to be relatively short, typically 3 to 10 characters in length. There are very few very short words of 1 or 2 characters and very few very long words. This is different from most European languages, which typically have a wider range of word lengths, including many very short function words like a, the, in, of, and to. The relative scarcity of very short words in Voynichese has been noted as a potentially significant feature, but its implications are unclear. Perhaps the most puzzling statistical property of the Voynich text is the extremely low level of repetition at the level of word sequences. In most natural languages, certain pairs and groups of words appear together frequently. In English, for example, the phrase of the is extremely common, as are phrases like in the, to the, it is, and that is. These repeated sequences, known as bigrams and trigrams, are a fundamental feature of natural language and are used extensively in computational linguistics and code breaking. In the Voynich manuscript, repeated word sequences are surprisingly rare. The same word seldom appears twice in a row, and multi-word phrases are almost never repeated verbatim. This is unusual for a natural language text and has been cited as evidence both for and against the hoax hypothesis. Proponents of the hoax theory argue that this low repetition is a sign that the text was generated by a random or semi-random process that did not capture the full complexity of natural language. Opponents argue that the low repetition could be a feature of the particular language or encoding system used, or that it could reflect the nature of the content, such as a list or catalog in which each entry is unique. The question of whether the Voynich manuscript is a hoax or a genuine text has been debated for over a century, and it remains one of the central controversies surrounding the manuscript. Let us examine the arguments on both sides. The hoax hypothesis holds that the manuscript was deliberately created to deceive. According to this theory, someone, perhaps in the 15th or 16th century, created a book filled with meaningless text and bizarre illustrations, and then sold it to a wealthy buyer who believed it to be a genuine and valuable text. The motivation would have been simple profit. In the 16th century, as in our own time, there was a thriving market for rare and unusual manuscripts. A book written in an unknown script, accompanied by intriguing illustrations, and attributed to a famous historical figure like Roger Bacon would have been extremely attractive to a collector, especially one like Emperor Rudolph II, who was known for his fascination with the mysterious and the occult. The most prominent candidate for the role of hoaxer is Edward Kelly, an English occultist and self-proclaimed spirit medium who lived from 1555 to 1597 or 98. Kelly is one of the most colorful and controversial figures of the Elizabethan era. He claimed to be able to communicate with angels through a system of scrying, using a polished stone or crystal ball to receive messages from the spiritual realm. He was the partner and associate of John Dee, one of the most learned men in England, a mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. Dee and Kelly worked together for several years, conducting elaborate seances during which Kelly would gaze into his scrying stone and report the messages he received from angelic beings. These messages were recorded in a language that Kelly called Enochian, which he claimed was the original language of the angels, the language spoken by Adam in the Garden of Eden. The Enochian language had its own alphabet, grammar, and vocabulary, and Dee recorded extensive texts in it. Whether Kelly genuinely believed he was receiving messages from angels, or was simply making it all up to maintain his position and income with Dee has been debated for centuries. Dee and Kelly traveled together to Prague in the 1580s and spent time at the court of Emperor Rudolph II. This places them in exactly the right location at approximately the right time to have been involved with the Voynich manuscript. Some scholars have proposed that Kelly created the manuscript as a forgery and sold it to Rudolph, either directly or through an intermediary, claiming it was a work of Roger Bacon's that contained secret alchemical knowledge. This theory would explain several features of the manuscript. The unknown script could be a variant or expansion of Kelly's Enochian language. The alchemical and astronomical content would have appealed to Rudolph's known interests, and the high price of 600 ducats would represent a handsome profit for a skilled forger. However, the Kelly theory has significant weaknesses. First, the manuscript's script does not closely resemble Enochian. While both are unknown alphabets, their specific characters and structural features are quite different. Second, creating a manuscript of this length and complexity would have been an enormous undertaking, requiring months or even years of work. The vellum alone would have been expensive, and the illustrations, while not masterpieces, are clearly the work of someone with considerable skill and patience. It seems unlikely that even a motivated forger would invest this much effort unless the potential reward was very high and the risk of detection very low. Third, and most importantly, as we shall discuss shortly, modern scientific testing has provided strong evidence about the manuscript's age that complicates the Kelly theory. Another candidate who has been proposed as a possible hoaxer is Wilfrid Voynich himself. According to this theory, Voynich, who was an expert in old manuscripts and had access to materials and techniques that would have allowed him to create a convincing forgery, fabricated the manuscript and invented its provenance to create a sensation and make a profit. This theory gained some traction in the mid-20th century, when skeptics noted that Voynich had been suspiciously vague about the circumstances of his purchase, and that he had promoted the Roger Bacon attribution with what seemed like excessive enthusiasm. However, the Voynich as hoaxer theory was dealt a fatal blow in 2009 when researchers at the University of Arizona subjected samples of the manuscript's vellum to radiocarbon dating. The results were unambiguous. The vellum was produced from animal skins that dated to between 1404 and 1438 with 95% confidence. This places the vellum firmly in the early 15th century, more than 450 years before Voynich acquired the manuscript. While it is theoretically possible that Voynich obtained old vellum and wrote on it with period-appropriate inks to create a forgery, this would have required a level of expertise and access to materials that seems implausible, even for an experienced rare book dealer. The radiocarbon dating also eliminated Roger Bacon as the manuscript's author, since Bacon died in 1292, more than a century before the vellum was produced. Unless the manuscript was copied from an earlier original by Bacon, which is possible but unsupported by any evidence, Bacon cannot have written the document that exists today. The radiocarbon dating did not, however, date the ink or the text itself. It is possible, at least in theory, that the vellum was produced in the early 15th century, but that the text and illustrations were added later. Analysis of the inks has been less conclusive than the vellum dating. The inks used in the manuscript appear to be consistent with those used in the 15th century, but ink analysis is less precise than radiocarbon dating, and the results cannot rule out the possibility that the text was added at a later date using period-appropriate materials. Despite these uncertainties, the majority of scholars who have studied the manuscript believe that both the vellum and the text date to the early 15th century. The consistency of the handwriting, the integration of the text with the illustrations, and the overall physical condition of the manuscript all support the conclusion that it was created as a unified document in a single campaign of production, most likely in the first half of the 1400s. If the manuscript is genuine, meaning that it was created in the early 15th century and contains text intended to convey meaningful information, then the question becomes, what language or encoding system was used? The most straightforward possibility is that the manuscript is written in a natural language using an unknown alphabet. Under this theory, the text represents a known language, perhaps Latin, Italian, German, or some other European language, but the sounds of that language are represented by an unfamiliar set of characters. If this is the case, then deciphering the manuscript would be relatively straightforward once the correspondence between the Voynich characters and the sounds of the underlying language is established. This is essentially the same process that was used to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. The Rosetta Stone provided a bilingual text that allowed scholars to match Egyptian symbols to known Greek words, and from there to work out the grammar and vocabulary of the Egyptian language. But the Voynich manuscript has no Rosetta Stone. There is no bilingual text, no parallel passage in a known language, no key or glossary that would allow researchers to establish the correspondence between Voynichese and any other writing system. Without such a key, the decipherment of an unknown script representing an unknown language is vastly more difficult. It is, in fact, one of the hardest problems in all of linguistics, and there are numerous examples of scripts that remained undeciphered for decades or even centuries before finally yielding their secrets. The decipherment of Linear B, the script used in Bronze Age Greece, provides an instructive comparison. Linear B was discovered on clay tablets at the Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete in the early 1900s. For 50 years, it resisted all attempts at decipherment. Then in 1952, a young English architect named Michael Ventris made a breakthrough. By carefully analyzing the patterns in the script and making an inspired guess that the underlying language was an early form of Greek, Ventris was able to assign sound values to many of the symbols and produce readings that made sense in the context of the tablets, which turned out to be administrative records listing goods, livestock, and personnel. Ventress's success with Linear B has inspired hope that the Voynich Manuscript might similarly yield to analysis, but there are important differences between the two cases. Linear B was written in a syllabic script with a large number of distinct signs, each representing a syllable. The Voynich script, with only 20 to 30 characters, appears to be an alphabetic script, which means that each character probably represents a single sound rather than a syllable. This makes it harder to analyze because alphabetic scripts convey less information per character than syllabic scripts, and the possible assignments of sounds to characters are more numerous. Another important difference is that Linear B was accompanied by a large body of related texts in related scripts, including Linear A and the Cypriot syllabary, which provided context and constraints that helped guide the decipherment. The Voynich script exists in complete isolation. There are no other texts in Voynichese, no inscriptions, no notes, no fragments. It is a writing system that appears to have been used for this one document and this one document alone. This isolation makes it far more difficult to study because there are no external checks or reference points that can be used to verify proposed readings. The possibility that the manuscript is written in a completely unknown natural language, one that has not survived into the modern period and is not recorded in any other document, has also been considered. History is full of languages that once flourished and then disappeared, leaving no trace in the written record. If the Voynich manuscript is the sole surviving document in such a language, then decipherment may be effectively impossible, because there would be no way to verify proposed translations against independent evidence. Some researchers have proposed that the manuscript might be written in a constructed or artificial language, a language that was deliberately created rather than one that evolved naturally. Constructed languages have a long history. The earliest known example is Hildegard von Bingen's Lingua Ignota, created in the 12th century by the German abbess and mystic. Later examples include the philosophical languages of the 17th century, designed by scholars like John Wilkins and Gottfried Leibniz, who attempted to create universal languages based on logical principles. In the modern era, constructed languages include Esperanto, Tolkien's Elvish languages, and the Klingon language from Star Trek. If the Voynich manuscript is written in a 15th century constructed language, this would make it one of the earliest examples of such a creation and would be a remarkable find in its own right, regardless of whether the text could ever be fully translated. However, constructing a language with the statistical properties observed in the Voynich text would be an extraordinary intellectual achievement, especially in the 15th century, when the scientific study of language was in its infancy. Some scholars have argued that the consistency and complexity of the text's statistical properties are simply too sophisticated to have been created artificially by a 15th century author, and that this is evidence that the underlying system is a natural language rather than a constructed one. Yet another possibility is that the manuscript is written in a cipher, an encoding system that transforms a known language into an unreadable form according to a specific set of rules. Ciphers have been used for thousands of years to protect sensitive information, and by the 15th century, cipher systems of considerable sophistication were in use across Europe, particularly in diplomatic and military communications. The simplest type of cipher is a substitution cipher, in which each letter of the original language is replaced by a different letter or symbol according to a fixed key. For example, every A might be replaced by a Z, every B by a Y, and so on. Simple substitution ciphers are relatively easy to break using frequency analysis, a technique developed by Arab scholars in the 9th century and well known in Europe by the Renaissance. Frequency analysis exploits the fact that in any language, certain letters and combinations of letters appear more often than others. In English, for example, the most common letter is E, followed by T, A, O, I, N, S, H, and R by counting the frequency of each symbol in an encrypted text, and comparing the results to the known frequencies of letters in the presumed original language, a codebreaker can often deduce the key and read the message. Frequency analysis has been applied to the Voynich Manuscript many times, but the results have been inconclusive. The frequency distribution of characters in Voynichese does not match the frequency distribution of any known European language, whether represented in its standard alphabet or in any of the many cipher systems that were known to be in use in the 15th century. This has led some researchers to conclude that either the cipher is more complex than a simple substitution, or the underlying language is not a European language, or the text is not a cipher at all. More complex cipher systems, such as polyalphabetic ciphers, which use multiple substitution alphabets in rotation, were also known in the 15th century. The earliest known description of a polyalphabetic cipher is attributed to Leon Battista Alberti, the Italian polymath, writing around 1467. Alberti's system used a device consisting of two concentric discs, each inscribed with an alphabet, which could be rotated to produce different substitution alphabets. More sophisticated polyalphabetic systems, such as the Wigner cipher, were developed in the 16th century and proved extremely resistant to frequency analysis. If the Voynich manuscript uses a polyalphabetic cipher or some other complex encoding system, this would explain why simple frequency analysis has failed to break it. However, modern cryptographic methods, including computer-assisted analysis, have been applied to the text with no greater success. The failure of these methods is significant because modern cryptanalysis is extraordinarily powerful. The techniques developed during and after the Second World War, when Allied codebreakers cracked the German Enigma machine and the Japanese Purple cipher, are capable of breaking virtually any cipher system that was available in the 15th century. The fact that these techniques have not yielded a solution suggests either that the cipher is exceptionally complex, that the underlying language is unknown, or that the text is not a cipher at all. We should now consider the many individuals and groups who have attempted to crack the Voynich code over the past century and the approaches they have used. One of the first serious attempts to decipher the manuscript was made by William Romain Newbold, a professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1921, Newbold announced that he had successfully decoded the manuscript and that it was indeed the work of Roger Bacon. According to Newbold, the text contained descriptions of microscopic organisms, cells, and biological structures that could only have been observed through a microscope centuries before the microscope was officially invented. Newbold claimed that Bacon had used a complex system of shorthand and anagramming to encode his observations, and that by applying this system, the text could be read as a sophisticated scientific treatise. Newbold's claims caused a sensation. If correct, they would have revolutionized the history of science, proving that optical instruments and microscopic observation were achieved far earlier than previously believed. However, Newbold's methodology was quickly and devastatingly critiqued by John Matthews Manley, a medievalist at the University of Chicago. Manley demonstrated that Newbold's method of decipherment was so subjective and flexible that it could produce almost any desired reading from almost any text. The anagramming technique that Newbold used involved rearranging the letters of supposed shorthand characters in so many possible ways that a skilled practitioner could find almost any message in the text. Manley showed that the same method, applied to random sequences of characters, could produce equally impressive-sounding scientific descriptions. Newbold's decipherment was thoroughly discredited, and it served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of wishful thinking and confirmation bias in Voynich research. Another notable attempt was made by Joseph Martin Fely, a lawyer from Rochester who published a proposed solution in 1943. Fely claimed that the manuscript was written in a modified form of abbreviated Latin, and he produced translations of several passages. However, his readings were unconvincing to other scholars, and his methodology was criticized for many of the same reasons as Newbold's. It was too flexible, too dependent on subjective judgments, and too easily capable of producing false results. The Voynich Manuscript also attracted the attention of professional military codebreakers. During the Second World War and in the decades that followed, several teams of cryptanalysts from various intelligence agencies attempted to crack the manuscript. The most notable of these efforts was led by William Friedman, widely regarded as one of the greatest codebreakers in history. Friedman had played a central role in breaking the Japanese diplomatic cipher known as Purple, a feat that contributed significantly to the Allied war effort. After the war, he turned his attention to the Voynich Manuscript, assembling a team of expert cryptanalysts and linguists to work on the problem. Friedman's team worked on the manuscript intermittently over a period of more than 20 years. They applied every technique in the cryptanalytic toolkit, including frequency analysis, pattern recognition, index of coincidence calculations, and various forms of statistical modeling. They also brought in experts on medieval languages, scripts, and cipher systems. Despite all of this expertise and effort, Friedman's team was unable to produce a decipherment. Friedman himself eventually concluded that the manuscript was probably written in an artificial language rather than a cipher, but he was unable to prove this hypothesis, and the conclusion remained speculative. The failure of Friedman and his team is perhaps the single most important piece of evidence regarding the nature of the Voynich text. These were people who had broken some of the most sophisticated cipher systems ever created, systems that were designed by professional cryptographers specifically to resist exactly the kind of analysis that Friedman's team was expert in. If the Voynich manuscript used any standard cipher technique known to the 15th century, or indeed to any period before the modern era, Friedman's team would almost certainly have been able to break it. Their failure suggests that the text is either not a cipher at all, or that it uses a cipher technique of a type that has never been encountered before or since. In the decades following Friedman's work, a number of other researchers have proposed solutions to the Voynich manuscript, and the pace of proposed solutions has accelerated dramatically since the manuscript was digitized and made available online. The internet has made it possible for anyone with a computer and an interest in puzzles to study the manuscript, and the result has been an explosion of theories, ranging from the carefully reasoned to the utterly fantastic. Some researchers have proposed that the manuscript is written in a Semitic language, such as Hebrew or Arabic, using a modified alphabet. Others have suggested that it is in a Turkic language or in a form of Chinese rendered in alphabetic notation. Still others have proposed connections to languages as diverse as Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, or Ukrainian, or an extinct Romance language. Each of these proposals has attracted some attention and generated some debate, but none has been widely accepted by the scholarly community. One of the most creative and influential theories about the Voynich text was proposed by Gordon Rugg, a computer scientist at Yale University in England. In 2004, Rugg published a paper arguing that the text could have been generated using a device called a Cardan grill, a sheet of cardboard with rectangular holes cut in it that could be placed over a table of characters to produce sequences that mimic the statistical properties of natural language without actually encoding any meaning. The Cardan grill was a real cryptographic device that was in use in the 16th century. It was named after Girolamo Cardano, the Italian mathematician who described it in 1550. Rugg showed that by placing a Cardan grill over a carefully designed table of Voynich's syllables, he could generate text that was statistically similar to the actual text of the manuscript. He argued that this demonstrated that the manuscript could be a hoax, created by a forger who used a Cardan grill to produce impressive-looking but meaningless text quickly and efficiently. Rugg's theory was widely discussed and generated considerable excitement because it offered a plausible mechanism for creating a hoax that would have been available to a 16th-century forger. However, the theory also received significant criticism. Other researchers pointed out that Rugg's generated text, while statistically similar to the Voynich text in some respects, did not match it in all respects. The word length distributions, the patterns of character repetition within words, and other fine-grained statistical properties were not perfectly reproduced by the Carden-Grill method. Critics argued that while Rugg had demonstrated that a Carden-Grill could produce text that superficially resembled Voynich's, he had not demonstrated that it could produce text that was a perfect statistical match, and the differences might be significant. The Carden-Grill theory also faces a historical objection. The grill was described by Cardano in 1550, but the vellum of the Voynich Manuscript dates to the early 15th century, more than a century earlier. If the text was added to old vellum at a later date using a Carden-Grill, this would be consistent with the theory, but there is no independent evidence for such a late addition. And if the text was indeed written in the early 15th century, as most scholars believe, then the Carden-Grill would not have been available since it had not yet been invented. Rugg has countered this objection by pointing out that the concept of using a template to generate text is simple enough that it could have been invented independently before Cardano's description, but this remains speculative. In recent years, the application of artificial intelligence and machine learning to the Voynich manuscript has generated considerable media attention and public interest. Several research teams have used neural networks, natural language processing algorithms, and other computational tools to analyze the text. These efforts have produced some intriguing results, but no breakthrough. In 2018, a team of computer scientists from the University of Alberta reported that they had used a neural network to analyze the Voynich text and had concluded that the underlying language was most likely Hebrew. Their algorithm attempted to match the statistical patterns of the Voynich text to the patterns of known languages and found the closest match with Hebrew, particularly when vowels were removed, as they often are in Hebrew writing. The team produced a tentative translation of the first sentence of the manuscript, which they rendered as a somewhat garbled statement about a priest or priestess and the eyes and fire. However, this proposed identification was met with considerable skepticism from both Voynich researchers and Hebrew scholars. The methodology was criticized for being overly dependent on statistical correlations that could be misleading, and the proposed translation was regarded as too vague and fragmentary to be convincing. The team acknowledged that their results were preliminary and that more work was needed. Other artificial intelligence approaches have focused on trying to identify the structure of the language rather than the specific language itself. Researchers have used clustering algorithms to identify groups of characters that tend to appear together, hoping to identify morphemes, the smallest meaningful units of language. They have used sequence analysis to identify patterns in the order of characters within words, hoping to discover grammatical rules. And they have used information-theoretic methods to measure the complexity and redundancy of the text, hoping to determine whether it is consistent with a natural language, an artificial language, or random noise. These computational approaches have confirmed several of the observations made by earlier researchers using manual methods. The text is not random. It has a structure that is consistent with, but not identical to, the structure of known natural languages. It follows Zipf's law. It has a characteristic entropy value. Words within it are composed of elements that combine according to rules, but the specific identity of the language and the meaning of the text remain as elusive as ever. Let us now turn from the text to the illustrations and consider what they might tell us about the manuscript's origins and purpose. The plants depicted in the herbal section have been the subject of intense scrutiny by botanists, historians of science, and Voynich enthusiasts. As noted earlier, most of the plants cannot be identified with any known species. However, several researchers have made tentative identifications that, while not universally accepted, may offer clues about the manuscript's geographical origin. In 2014, a researcher named Arthur Tucker, a professor of botany at Delaware State University, along with his colleague Rixford Talbert, published a paper arguing that several of the plants in the Voynich herbal section could be identified as species native to the New World, particularly to Mexico and Central America. Tucker and Talbert identified what they believed to be drawings of sunflowers, which are native to the Western Hemisphere and were not known in Europe until after the voyages of exploration in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. They also identified what they claimed were drawings of a Mexican plant called Ipomoea murucoides, a type of morning glory, and several other species that are found in Mesoamerica. If Tucker and Talbert's identifications are correct, they would have profound implications for the manuscript's dating and provenance. They would suggest either that the manuscript was created after European contact with the New World, which would conflict with the early 15th century radiocarbon date for the vellum, or that there was pre-Columbian contact between Europe and the Western Hemisphere that introduced New World plants to European knowledge before the voyages of Columbus and his contemporaries. However, Tucker and Talbert's identifications have been questioned by other botanists, who point out that the illustrations are so stylized and imprecise that they could be interpreted as depicting a wide variety of plants from many different regions. The identification of specific species from such ambiguous drawings is inherently subjective, and different researchers looking at the same illustration can reach very different conclusions. Other researchers have focused on the European botanical tradition, attempting to match the Voynich plants to species found in the herbals of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Some have argued that the plants are stylized depictions of common European medicinal herbs, drawn in a manner that reflects a specific regional artistic tradition. Others have suggested that the plants are deliberately disguised, drawn inaccurately on purpose to protect the author's knowledge from unauthorized readers. The astronomical illustrations in the manuscript have also been analyzed in detail. Several pages feature large circular diagrams that clearly depict the zodiac. The zodiac signs are recognizable, though they are drawn in a style that is somewhat unusual. The images of Pisces, Aries, Taurus, and other signs are present, and each is surrounded by rings of text and additional figures, typically the small nude women mentioned earlier. One intriguing feature of the astronomical section is that the month names associated with the zodiac signs appear to be written in a language other than Voynichese. Researchers have identified what seem to be month names in a Romance language, possibly an archaic form of French, Spanish, or Occitan. These names are among the very few elements of the manuscript that can be read with any confidence, and they suggest a connection to the Romance-speaking regions of Europe, perhaps southern France, Spain, or Italy. This observation has led some researchers to propose that the manuscript originated in the Mediterranean region, perhaps in a community that spoke a Romance language and was influenced by both European and non-European intellectual traditions. The presence of both readable Romance month names and an otherwise unreadable script has been interpreted as evidence that the manuscript was created by someone who was familiar with European culture, but who used a private or specialized writing system for the main text. The biological section, with its images of nude women bathing in pools and tubes, has prompted extensive speculation about the manuscript's cultural and intellectual context. Some researchers have connected these images to the medieval tradition of balneology, the study and practice of therapeutic bathing. In the medieval and early Renaissance periods, bathhouses were important social and medical institutions across Europe. The healing properties of natural springs and mineral waters were widely recognized, and bathing was prescribed as a treatment for a variety of ailments, including skin diseases, joint problems, and reproductive issues. The images in the biological section could potentially depict a bathing regimen, with the tubes and pools representing the plumbing of a bathhouse or the channels through which water or other fluids were directed. The nude figures would be patients or bathers, and the overall section could be a guide to therapeutic bathing practices. This interpretation is consistent with the manuscript's apparent focus on health and medicine, as suggested by the herbal and pharmaceutical sections. Other interpretations of the biological section are more esoteric. Some scholars have connected the images to alchemical symbolism, in which the transformation of base metals into gold was often depicted allegorically as a process of purification involving the human body. Alchemical texts frequently used images of nude figures, baths, and vessels to represent stages of the alchemical process, and the biological section of the Voynich Manuscript could potentially be read in this light. Still, other researchers have proposed connections to Kabbalistic or mystical Jewish traditions, in which water, purification, and the human body played important symbolic roles. The mikveh, or ritual bath, is a central institution in Jewish life, and its spiritual significance could potentially be reflected in the manuscript's images. This interpretation is sometimes combined with the proposal that the manuscript's text is in Hebrew or another Semitic language. The question of the manuscript's geographical origin has been approached from multiple angles. In addition to the evidence provided by the illustrations, researchers have analyzed the physical characteristics of the vellum, the composition of the inks and pigments, and the style of the handwriting in an effort to determine where the manuscript was produced. The vellum appears to be made from calf skin, which was the standard material for manuscript production in Europe during the 15th century. Analysis of the parchment has not revealed any features that would definitively identify the region where the calves were raised or where the vellum was prepared, though some researchers have noted similarities to vellum produced in Italy. The inks and pigments have been analyzed using various spectroscopic techniques. The main text appears to have been written with an iron gall ink, which was the most common type of ink used for writing in medieval and Renaissance Europe. The pigments used for the illustrations include green, brown, red, blue, and yellow, applied in washes and sometimes in more opaque layers. The specific compositions of these pigments are consistent with materials that were widely available in 15th century Europe, including plant-based dyes, mineral pigments, and possibly some metallic compounds. The style of the handwriting, while unique in terms of the specific characters used, has been compared to the handwriting styles prevalent in different regions of Europe during the 15th century. Some paleographers, experts in the study of historical handwriting, have noted similarities between the ductus, or the way the pen was moved to form characters, in the Voynich Manuscript and the handwriting styles common in Italy and Central Europe during this period. However, since the characters themselves are unique, these comparisons are necessarily tentative. Several researchers have attempted to determine the number of scribes who worked on the manuscript. The dominant view, based on detailed analysis of the handwriting, is that there were either one or two scribes. Some portions of the text appear to have been written with a slightly different hand, suggesting that a second person may have contributed to the writing. However, the differences are subtle and could also be explained by changes in the primary scribe's writing over time, such as might occur if the manuscript was produced over a period of months or years, or if the scribe wrote at different times of day, at different speeds, or with different pens. We have now surveyed the physical characteristics of the manuscript, the nature of its text and illustrations, the history of its provenance, and the many attempts that have been made to decipher it. But we have not yet addressed some of the most fascinating and far-reaching questions that the Voynich Manuscript raises. What kind of person would create such a book? What was its intended purpose? And what does its existence tell us about the world in which it was created? To answer these questions, we must immerse ourselves in the intellectual and cultural world of early 15th century Europe. This was a period of profound transformation, a time when the old certainties of the medieval world were beginning to crumble and the foundations of the modern world were being laid. The Black Death, which had swept through Europe in the middle of the 14th century, had killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the continent's population, shattering social structures, disrupting economic systems, and profoundly shaking people's faith in the established order. The survivors of the plague found themselves in a world that was in many ways unrecognizable, a world in which labor was scarce, land was cheap, and the old feudal relationships between lords and peasants were breaking down. In the realm of ideas, the early 15th century saw the continuation of trends that had begun in the 14th century and would culminate in the Renaissance and the Reformation. Humanism, the intellectual movement that emphasized the study of classical Greek and Roman texts and the development of individual human potential, was spreading from Italy to the rest of Europe. Scholars were rediscovering the works of ancient philosophers, scientists, and poets, and using them as the basis for a new approach to learning that valued observation, reason, and individual inquiry over tradition and authority. At the same time, the older traditions of medieval learning, including alchemy, astrology, and herbalism, remained vigorous and influential. These disciplines, which modern readers might be tempted to dismiss as superstition or pseudoscience, were serious intellectual pursuits in the 15th century, studied and practiced by many of the most educated and respected members of society. Alchemy in particular was a complex and sophisticated tradition that combined practical chemistry with philosophical speculation and mystical symbolism. Alchemists sought not only to transform base metals into gold, but also to understand the fundamental nature of matter, to discover the universal solvent, and to create the philosopher's stone, a substance that could cure all diseases and confer immortality. The Voynich Manuscript, with its combination of herbal, astronomical, and possibly alchemical content, fits naturally into this intellectual milieu. It is exactly the kind of document that a 15th-century scholar, physician, or alchemist might have produced, a compendium of knowledge about the natural world, organized according to a system that made sense to its creator, even if that system is opaque to modern readers. The use of an unknown script or cipher would also be consistent with the practices of the period. Many alchemists and natural philosophers used secret writing systems to protect their knowledge from competitors, from the church, or from the uninitiated. The tradition of secret or esoteric knowledge, passed from master to student through encoded texts and oral instruction, was deeply embedded in medieval intellectual culture. But if the Voynich Manuscript is a product of this tradition, why is its script so thoroughly unlike any other known cipher or secret writing system? Why has it resisted decipherment by experts who have cracked codes that were designed to be unbreakable? And why do its illustrations depict plants and structures that do not correspond to any known real-world counterparts? These questions lead us to some of the more speculative and imaginative theories about the manuscript's origins. One such theory is that the manuscript was created by a community of outsiders, a group of people who lived on the margins of European society and maintained their own distinct language, writing system, and body of knowledge. Candidates for such a community include the Cathars, a Christian sect in southern France that was brutally suppressed by the Catholic Church in the 13th century. The Roma, a nomadic people who arrived in Europe from South Asia in the medieval period and who maintained a distinct language and culture, and various Jewish communities which often lived in relative isolation from their Christian neighbors and maintained their own intellectual traditions. Each of these proposals has its attractions and its weaknesses. The Cathar theory would explain the manuscript's apparent connection to southern France, as suggested by the Romance month names, and the Cathars were known to have had their own theological and philosophical traditions that differed significantly from mainstream Catholicism. However, the Cathar movement was effectively destroyed by the Albigensian Crusade and the Inquisition in the 13th and 14th centuries, and it is unclear whether any Cathar community survived long enough to have produced a manuscript in the early 15th century. The Roma theory would explain the use of an unknown language, since Romani, the language of the Roma, is an Indo-Aryan language that is quite different from the European languages that surrounded it. However, there is no evidence that the Roma had a written tradition in the 15th century, and the manuscript's elaborate illustrations and sophisticated layout suggest a level of resources and expertise that would have been unusual for a marginalized and often persecuted community. The Jewish theory has perhaps the most to recommend it. Jewish scholars in the medieval period were often multilingual and literate, with access to intellectual traditions in Hebrew, Arabic, and various European languages. They had a strong tradition of textual production and of the use of codes and ciphers to protect sensitive information. The Kabbalah, the mystical tradition within Judaism, made extensive use of symbolic and numerological systems that could potentially underlie the Voynich text. And the presence of bathing imagery in the biological section could conceivably be connected to the Jewish practice of ritual immersion. However, none of these community-based theories has been confirmed, and all remain speculative. The fundamental problem is that the Voynich manuscript is an isolated artifact. There are no other documents that can be clearly connected to it, no other texts in the same script, no historical references that definitively identify its creator or the community from which it came. It exists in a kind of historical vacuum, a single point of light in an otherwise total darkness. As we draw the first part of our exploration to a close, let us take a moment to appreciate the sheer improbability of the Voynich manuscript's existence. In a world where knowledge was power and where the written word was treated with reverence and respect, someone invested an enormous amount of time, effort, and resources to create a book that, as far as we can tell, no one else could read. They prepared vellum, mixed inks, planned and executed hundreds of detailed illustrations, and filled page after page with text in a script that has no parallel anywhere in the world. They did all of this with obvious skill and care, producing a document that has survived for more than 500 years, and that continues to fascinate and frustrate the best minds of every generation. Why? What possible motivation could have driven such an effort? Was the creator trying to preserve knowledge that was too dangerous or too valuable to write in a language that others could read? Were they recording the teachings of a tradition that was being persecuted and driven underground? Were they creating a personal journal in a private language, a diary of thoughts and observations that was never meant to be shared? Were they constructing an elaborate intellectual puzzle, a test for future generations of scholars? Or were they, as some have suggested, simply creating a beautiful and mysterious object, a work of art that derives its power precisely from its incomprehensibility? We do not know, we may never know. But the fact that we keep asking these questions, that the Voynich manuscript continues to inspire wonder and curiosity and frustration and obsession more than 500 years after it was created, tells us something important about the human relationship to knowledge. We are a species that cannot rest when confronted with a mystery. We are driven to understand, to decode, to translate, to explain. The Voynich manuscript is a mirror that reflects this drive back at us, challenging us to confront the limits of our understanding and to accept, at least for now, that some secrets may be beyond our reach. The manuscript sits in its climate-controlled case in the Voynich Library, its pages softened by centuries of handling, its colors slightly faded but still vivid, its text as unreadable today as it was when the ink was fresh. Thousands of people have looked at it, held it, photographed it, scanned it, analyzed it, puzzled over it, and walked away empty-handed. And yet the next visitor, the next researcher, the next curious mind who opens those pages does so with the same hope that has sustained all of the others, the hope that this time something will click, some pattern will emerge, some key will turn, and the silent voice of the Voynich manuscript will finally speak. In the chapters of human knowledge, there are many volumes that have been lost to fire, to flood, to the ravages of time and the carelessness of those who held them. The great library of Alexandria, which once held hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, was destroyed and its contents scattered or burned. Countless manuscripts were lost during the barbarian invasions that swept through Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Monastic libraries were plundered during the Reformation, and private collections were dispersed during wars and revolutions. The Voynich manuscript is remarkable not because it contains lost knowledge, though it may, but because it survived. It survived the centuries during which so much was destroyed. It passed from hand to hand, from alchemist to scholar to emperor to Jesuit to book dealer to university library, and at no point in its long journey was it discarded, destroyed, or forgotten. Someone always believed that it was worth keeping. Someone always believed that it might someday yield its secrets. That belief persists today. Around the world, in universities and research laboratories and home offices and coffee shops, people are working on the Voynich Manuscript right now at this very moment. Some are linguists, applying the latest computational techniques to the text. Some are historians, searching for new archival evidence that might illuminate the manuscript's origins. Some are botanists, poring over the illustrations and comparing them to the vast digital databases of plant species that are now available. Some are amateur enthusiasts, drawn to the manuscript by its mystique and determined to be the one who finally cracks the code. And somewhere in the background, the manuscript itself waits, patient and inscrutable, its pages holding their secrets with the same calm indifference with which they have held them for more than half a millennium. It does not care whether we read it or not, it simply is what it is, a beautiful, maddening, magnificent puzzle, the book that no one can read. But the story does not end here. There are more theories to explore, more evidence to examine, more questions to ask. The tale of the Voynich Manuscript is a tale of obsession and genius, of fraud and faith, of the eternal human quest to understand the unknown. And in the second part of our journey, we will delve deeper into the darkness, following the trail of clues and conjectures that lead us ever closer to the heart of this most extraordinary mystery. The physical pages of the Voynich Manuscript tell a story beyond the words and pictures they contain. They speak of careful preparation and deliberate intent. Each leaf of vellum was cut from animal skin, likely calf skin, and prepared through a laborious process of soaking, stretching, scraping, and drying that was standard in the workshops of medieval parchment makers. The preparation of vellum was a skilled trade, requiring knowledge of materials and techniques that were passed down through generations of craftsmen. The quality of the vellum in the Voynich Manuscript is generally good, though not exceptional. It shows the kind of minor imperfections, small holes, rough patches, and variations in thickness that are typical of vellum produced for everyday use rather than for luxury editions. This suggests that the manuscript was not intended to be a presentation copy for a wealthy patron, nor a showpiece for a monastic library, but rather a working document, a book that was meant to be used. The gatherings of the manuscript, the groups of folded leaves that make up its pages, are organized in a way that is broadly consistent with standard book-making practices of the 15th century, but that also shows some unusual features. Some gatherings contain fold-out pages, large sheets of vellum that are folded multiple times to fit within the binding, and that, when unfolded, reveal elaborate diagrams that span several times the area of a normal page. These fold-out pages are among the most visually impressive elements of the manuscript, and they suggest that the creator placed particular importance on the diagrams they contain, devoting extra space and effort to their presentation. The binding of the manuscript in its current form is not original. It has been rebound at least once, possibly multiple times, over the centuries. The current binding is a simple limp vellum cover that was probably added in the 17th or 18th century. The original binding, if it ever existed, has been lost. Some researchers have speculated that the original binding might have contained additional clues about the manuscript's origins, such as a title, an author's name, or a coat of arms, but this is purely speculative. The ordering of the pages within the manuscript has also been questioned. Some researchers believe that the pages may not be in their original order, that the manuscript may have been disassembled and reassembled at some point in its history, and that pages may have been lost, rearranged, or inserted. This complicates analysis because the relationship between adjacent pages and the overall narrative or logical flow of the manuscript may not reflect the creator's original intent. One of the most intriguing physical features of the manuscript is the presence of what appear to be choir numbers, numbers written on the first page of each gathering that indicate its position within the manuscript. These numbers suggest that the manuscript was originally organized in a specific sequence and that the gatherings were meant to be read in a particular order. The choir numbers are written in Arabic numerals, which were in common use in Europe by the 15th century, having been introduced from the Islamic world several centuries earlier. The presence of Arabic numerals is consistent with the manuscripts dating to the 15th century, but does not help to narrow down its geographical origin. The colors used in the manuscript's illustrations deserve particular attention. The palette is limited but distinctive. The dominant color is green, which is used extensively to fill in the leaves and stems of plants, the pools and tubes in the biological section, and various other elements throughout the manuscript. Blue, red, brown, and yellow are also used, though less frequently. The specific shades and textures of the pigments have been analyzed using spectroscopy and other techniques, and the results suggest that the pigments are mineral-based and plant-based dyes that were commonly used in European manuscript production during the 15th century. One notable feature of the coloring is that it appears to have been applied after the text and line drawings were completed. In many cases, the color washes overlap the lines of the drawings, suggesting that the coloring was done by a different person or at a different time than the drawing. This two-stage process, first drawing in ink, then adding color, was standard practice in manuscript production, and it sometimes resulted in errors where the colorist filled in the wrong areas or used colors that were inconsistent with the drawing. Some researchers have noted such errors in the Voynich Manuscript and have suggested that the colorist may not have fully understood the drawings they were coloring, which would imply that the coloring was done by someone other than the original artist. Let us also consider the blank pages and the gaps in the manuscript. Not every page is filled with text and illustrations. Some pages are blank or nearly blank, and some appear to have been left incomplete. These gaps might indicate that the manuscript was never finished, that the creator died or was interrupted before completing the work. Alternatively, the gaps might be intentional, serving as markers between sections or as spaces where additional content was planned to be added later. The existence of apparently unfinished sections is interesting because it suggests that the manuscript was a work in progress, a living document that was being created over a period of time rather than a polished, finished product. This is consistent with the interpretation of the manuscript as a working reference book rather than a presentation piece. Now let us return to the question of provenance and try to trace the manuscript's history as far back as the evidence allows. The letter from Marseille to Kircher in 1665 is the earliest firmly documented record of the manuscript's existence. But the letter mentions earlier owners, including Georg Bersch and allegedly Emperor Rudolf II, and we can use these references to push the timeline back further. Georg Bersch appears in historical records as an obscure alchemist who lived in Prague in the early to mid-17th century. Very little is known about him beyond his connection to the Voynich Manuscript. He wrote to Kircher at least twice, in 1637 and again later, describing the manuscript and asking for help with its decipherment. In his letters, Bersch described the manuscript as containing images of exotic plants, stars, and other mysterious subjects, and he expressed frustration at his inability to read the text. He believed that the manuscript might contain knowledge from the Orient, perhaps brought to Europe by travelers or traders, and he hoped that Kircher's expertise in Oriental languages might enable him to decipher it. Bersch's letters are significant for several reasons. First, they establish that the manuscript was in Prague by the 1630s, which is consistent with the tradition that it had been purchased by Rudolf II in the late 16th century. Second, they show that the manuscript was already considered unreadable at that time, suggesting that whatever knowledge of its text may once have existed had already been lost. Third, they provide a description of the manuscript's contents that matches the manuscript we have today, confirming that the Voynich manuscript is the same document that Bersch possessed. The claim that Emperor Rudolf purchased the manuscript for 600 ducats is based solely on the statement in Marseille's letter, where Marseille attributes this information to a source whose identity is not specified. Some scholars have questioned whether this claim is reliable. Rudolf II is well documented as a collector of curiosities and a patron of alchemists and astrologers, and it is entirely plausible that he would have purchased such a manuscript. However, 600 ducats was an extremely large sum, and it is not clear that even Rudolf would have paid so much for a single manuscript, especially one that no one could read. Some researchers have suggested that the price may have been exaggerated, either by the seller to justify a high asking price or by later owners to increase the manuscript's prestige and value. If Rudolf did purchase the manuscript, the question arises, from whom did he buy it? And how did it come to be in Prague in the first place? These questions lead us into the murky territory of rumor and speculation. One possibility is that the manuscript was brought to Prague by John Dee and Edward Kelly, who, as mentioned earlier, visited Rudolf's court in the 1580s. Dee was known to have owned a large collection of manuscripts, and it is plausible that he might have had the Voynich Manuscript in his possession and sold it to Rudolf. However, there is no direct evidence for this, and the connection to Dee and Kelly remains unproven. Another possibility is that the manuscript came to Prague through the vast network of traders, scholars, and diplomats who crisscrossed Europe during the Renaissance. Prague was a major intellectual and cultural center in the late 16th century, and manuscripts and books flowed into the city from all across the continent. The Voynich manuscript could have been purchased by Rudolf from any of the many book dealers, collectors, and agents who served his court. Before the manuscript reached Prague, its history is a complete blank. We do not know where it was created, who created it, or how it was transmitted during the first century and a half of its existence. This gap in the provenance, from the manuscript's creation around 1404 to 1438 to its first documented appearance in the 1630s, is one of the most frustrating aspects of the mystery. If we could fill in this gap, if we could identify the workshop or scriptorium where the manuscript was produced, or the library or collection in which it was first kept, we would have a much better chance of understanding its purpose and deciphering its contents. Several researchers have attempted to fill this gap by looking for indirect evidence of the manuscript's existence in historical records from the 15th and 16th centuries. They have searched for references to mysterious or unreadable manuscripts in the correspondence and catalogs of collectors, in the records of monastic libraries, and in the writings of scholars who were active during this period. So far, no conclusive identifications have been made, though a few tantalizing possibilities have been noted. One such possibility involves a reference in the diary of a 15th-century Italian scholar to a mysterious manuscript written in an unknown script that he encountered in a private collection. The description is vague and could refer to any number of manuscripts, but some researchers have speculated that it might be a reference to the Voynich manuscript. If so, this would place the manuscript in Italy in the 15th century, which would be consistent with some of the other evidence, including the Romance month names and the vellum's apparent Italian origin. As we near the conclusion of this first part, let us step back and consider the larger significance of the Voynich manuscript. Why does this small, unassuming book matter? Why has it captured the imagination of so many people for so long? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the mystery itself. The Voynich manuscript is not just a puzzle, it is a puzzle that seems as though it should be solvable. The text is clearly organized, clearly structured, clearly the product of a rational mind. The illustrations, however strange, are clearly meant to represent something. The manuscript as a whole is clearly a coherent document, created with a specific purpose in mind. Everything about it says that there is a solution, that somewhere, hidden in the patterns of its characters and the shapes of its drawings, there is a key that would unlock everything. And yet that key remains hidden. Despite a century of effort, despite the application of every analytical technique that modern science and scholarship have to offer, the manuscript remains as silent as ever. This contrast between the apparent accessibility of the puzzle and the actual impossibility of solving it is deeply compelling. It draws people in, convinces them that they are the ones who will succeed where all others have failed, and then, inevitably, frustrates them as the manuscript refuses to yield its secrets. But the Voynich Manuscript matters for more than just its mystery. It matters because it reminds us that the past is a foreign country, a place where people thought differently, believed differently, and understood the world in ways that may be fundamentally incompatible with our own assumptions. We tend to think of the medieval period as a simpler time, a time when people knew less and understood less than we do today. The Voynich Manuscript challenges this assumption. It confronts us with the possibility that someone in the 15th century created something that our 21st century minds cannot comprehend. It forces us to consider the humbling possibility that our modern technology, our artificial intelligence, our vast databases of knowledge, may not be enough to overcome the barriers of time and culture and language that separate us from the world of the manuscript's creator. The Voynich Manuscript also matters because it is a reminder of how much we have lost. The medieval world produced an enormous volume of written material, only a fraction of which has survived to the present day. For every manuscript that was carefully preserved in a library or archive, hundreds or thousands of others were destroyed by fire, water, insects, neglect, or deliberate act. The knowledge contained in those lost manuscripts is gone forever, and we can only guess at what it might have told us about the people who created it and the world in which they lived. The Voynich Manuscript is one of the survivors. Against all odds, it has endured for more than 500 years. It has crossed continents and passed through wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of empires. It has been owned by alchemists, emperors, Jesuits, book dealers, and universities. And through all of these vicissitudes, it has kept its secrets intact. Perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about it. In a world where almost everything can be known, where the sum of human knowledge is available at the touch of a button, where satellites can read license plates from orbit and algorithms can predict what we will buy before we know we want it, the Voynich Manuscript remains opaque. It is a reminder that the universe still contains things that we do not understand, things that may be beyond our capacity to understand, things that exist outside the frameworks and categories and models that we use to make sense of reality. And that, perhaps, is why we cannot stop looking at it. That is why we cannot stop trying to read it. And that is why the Voynich Manuscript, the book that no one can read, remains the most fascinating and frustrating document in the history of the world. This concludes the first part of our journey into the mystery of the Voynich Manuscript, but our exploration is far from over. In the second part, we will examine the most compelling modern theories about the manuscript's origins and meaning. We will follow the threads of evidence that lead to monasteries and alchemists' workshops, to courts and counting houses, to the laboratories of cryptanalysts and the servers of artificial intelligence researchers. We will consider the possibility that the manuscript is a genuine medical text, an alchemical treatise, a mystical vision, or something else entirely. And we will confront the ultimate question: will the Voynich Manuscript ever be read, or will it remain forever silent, a locked door for which no key exists? The answer, like the manuscript itself, may be more complex and more surprising than we imagine. A single page of vellum, stained by the passage of 5 centuries, lies open beneath a magnifying lens. On it, a plant grows upward from roots that curl like serpents, its stem twisting into shapes that no botanist has ever named, its leaves spreading in formations that belong to no species catalogued in any flora of any continent. Beside the plant, in neat rows of elegant, curving script, words march across the page with the quiet confidence of a language that knows exactly what it means. But we do not know, we have never known. And after 100 years of sustained, brilliant, sometimes desperate effort, we are no closer to reading those words than we were the day Wilfrid Voynich first opened this book in the shadowed halls of Villa Mondragon and felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Welcome back to the second part of our journey into the deepest and most enduring mystery in the history of the written word. The Voynich Manuscript has waited patiently for us, as it has waited for everyone who has ever turned its pages, and it will continue to wait long after we are gone. But for now, let us press forward deeper into the labyrinth, following every thread of evidence, every theory, every wild conjecture, every moment of seeming breakthrough and inevitable disappointment, until we have exhausted everything that can be said about this extraordinary document. And perhaps along the way, we will discover something not just about the manuscript, but about ourselves, about the nature of knowledge, and about the limits of the human mind. When we left off, we had surveyed the manuscript's physical characteristics, its illustrations, its text, its provenance, and the major attempts that had been made to decipher it through the mid-20th century. We had examined the work of William Romaine Newbold, whose spectacular and ultimately discredited claims about Roger Bacon and microscopes captivated the world in the 1920s. We had discussed William Friedman, the legendary codebreaker whose team spent 2 decades grappling with the manuscript and walked away defeated. And we had considered the statistical properties of the text, which tantalize researchers with their resemblance to natural language while refusing to reveal which language lies beneath. Now let us go further. Let us examine the theories that have emerged in the decades since Friedman's work, the new tools that have been brought to bear on the problem, and the extraordinary cast of characters who have devoted their lives, their careers, and in some cases their sanity to the pursuit of the Voynich Manuscript's secrets. One of the most important developments in Voynich research came in the 1970s and 80s, when a prescriptive linguist and ethnobotanist named Prescott Currier made a discovery that would fundamentally change the way researchers thought about the manuscript. Currier, who had worked as a naval intelligence officer and had experience with cryptanalysis, conducted a detailed statistical analysis of the Voynich text and concluded that it could be divided into 2 distinct languages, which he called Language A and Language B. Currier's analysis showed that certain sections of the manuscript used characters and character combinations in statistically different ways from other sections. The herbal section, for instance, seemed to use a different distribution of characters than the biological section. Currier proposed that these differences could be explained in several ways. Perhaps the manuscript was written by 2 different scribes, each using a slightly different version of the same encoding system. Perhaps the manuscript was written in 2 different languages or in 2 different dialects of the same language. Perhaps the cipher system used a different key for different sections of the text. Currier's discovery of Language A and Language B was significant because it introduced a new level of complexity into the analysis of the manuscript. If the text was not uniform, if different sections followed different rules, then any attempt at decipherment that treated the entire manuscript as a single homogeneous text was doomed to fail. The distinction between Language A and Language B has been confirmed and refined by subsequent researchers using more sophisticated statistical methods, and it remains one of the foundational observations in the field of Voynich studies. The question of why the manuscript might contain 2 different textual styles has never been satisfactorily answered. The 2-scribe hypothesis is plausible but not proven. Some researchers have argued that the differences between Language A and Language B are too systematic to be explained by individual variation in handwriting, and that they must reflect a structural difference in the underlying text. Others have pointed out that the differences, while statistically significant, are relatively subtle and could easily arise from normal variation in a single person's writing over a period of months or years. The discovery of 2 languages within the manuscript also raised an intriguing possibility. What if the different sections of the manuscript dealt with different subjects, and the textual differences reflected the different vocabularies and grammatical structures appropriate to those subjects? In any natural language, a text about botany will use different words and phrases than a text about astronomy or medicine. If the Voynich Manuscript is a genuine encyclopedic work covering multiple subjects, then the statistical differences between sections might simply reflect the different vocabularies required for different topics. This interpretation supports the view that the manuscript is a genuine text rather than a hoax. A hoaxer generating random text would have no reason to create systematic statistical differences between different sections. Only a genuine text, written in a real language and dealing with real subjects, would naturally exhibit such differences. In the 1990s, a new generation of researchers began applying the rapidly advancing tools of computer science to the Voynich Manuscript. The digitization of the manuscript, which made high-resolution images of every page available to anyone with an internet connection, democratized Voynich research in a way that had never been possible before. Previously, studying the manuscript required either traveling to the Voynich Library or obtaining expensive photographic reproductions. Now, anyone with a computer could examine the text and illustrations in extraordinary detail. The availability of digital images led to a proliferation of online communities dedicated to the study of the manuscript. Forums, mailing lists, and websites sprang up, populated by a diverse mix of professional scholars, amateur enthusiasts, retired military cryptanalysts, computer programmers, linguists, and curious members of the general public. These communities became hotbeds of discussion and debate, generating a constant stream of new ideas, new analyses, and new proposed solutions. The vast majority of these proposed solutions were quickly dismissed by other members of the community. The Voynich research community, hardened by decades of false starts and discredited claims, had developed a healthy skepticism toward any announcement of a breakthrough. New proposals were subjected to rigorous scrutiny, and their weaknesses were identified and dissected with sometimes brutal efficiency. This culture of critical evaluation, while sometimes discouraging to newcomers, served an important function. It prevented the field from being overrun by poorly reasoned or unsupported claims and ensured that only the most robust theories survived long enough to receive serious consideration. Among the most significant contributions of the online research community was the creation of comprehensive databases and transcription systems for the Voynich text. Several teams of researchers worked to create standardized transcriptions of the manuscript, converting the handwritten characters into digital text that could be processed by computers. The most widely used transcription system, known as EVA, which stands for European Voynich Alphabet, was developed by René Zandbergen and Gabriel Landini in the mid-1990s. EVA assigns a Latin letter to each distinct character in the Voynich script, allowing the text to be typed, searched, and analyzed using standard computing tools. The creation of EVA and similar transcription systems was a crucial step forward because it made it possible to apply the full range of computational linguistic tools to the Voynich text. Researchers could now calculate character frequencies, word frequencies, bigram and trigram frequencies, entropy values, and other statistical measures with speed and precision that would have been impossible using manual methods. They could search for patterns, test hypotheses, and compare the Voynich text to corpora of text in known languages on a scale that dwarfed anything that had been attempted before. These computational analyses confirmed and extended many of the observations that had been made by earlier researchers. The text was not random. It had a rich and complex internal structure. It followed Zipf's law. Its entropy was consistent with a natural language. Its words were composed of elements that combined according to rules, but the identity of the language and the meaning of the text remained as elusive as ever. One of the most detailed and careful computational analyses of the Voynich text was carried out by Jorge Stolfi, a computer scientist at the University of Campinas in Brazil. Stolfi devoted years to the study of the manuscript and produced a series of papers and reports that are widely regarded as among the most important contributions to the field. His analysis revealed a number of striking features of the text that had not been previously recognized. Stolfi observed that Voynich words appear to have a highly regular internal structure, what he called a paradigmatic structure. Many words seem to be built from a small set of building blocks or morphemes that combine in a limited number of ways. For example, certain character groups tend to appear at the beginning of words, others in the middle, and still others at the end, with very few exceptions. This regularity is more extreme than what is typically found in natural languages, where word formation rules are usually more flexible and admit a greater variety of combinations. Stolfi interpreted this extreme regularity as evidence that the Voynich text might not be in a natural language at all, but rather in some kind of structured code or artificial system. He proposed that the text might use a verbose cipher, a system in which each unit of meaning in the original language is represented by a word-like unit in the cipher text, but where the mapping between the two is not a simple one-to-one substitution. Under such a system, the patterns observed in the text would reflect the structure of the cipher rather than the structure of the underlying language, which could explain why the text's properties do not match any known language. Stolfi's work highlighted a fundamental problem in Voynich research: the difficulty of distinguishing between patterns that reflect the structure of the underlying language and patterns that reflect the structure of the encoding system. If the text is written in a simple substitution cipher, then the patterns in the cipher text should directly mirror the patterns in the original language, and it should be possible to identify the language by comparing these patterns to known languages. But if the cipher is more complex, involving multiple layers of encoding, substitution, transposition, or other transformations, then the patterns in the cipher text may bear little resemblance to the patterns in the original language, making identification much more difficult or even impossible. Another influential researcher who emerged during this period was Jacques Guy, an Australian linguist who published a series of papers arguing that the Voynich text might be written in an East Asian language, possibly Chinese or a related language, using an alphabetic or syllabic notation system. Guy pointed out that several of the statistical properties of the Voynich text, including its low entropy, its highly regular word structure, and its relatively small vocabulary, were more consistent with the properties of Chinese than with any European language. He also noted that Chinese, as a tonal language, could potentially be represented alphabetically using a notation system that indicated the tones and phonemes of each syllable, and that such a system might produce text with properties similar to those observed in the Voynich Manuscript. Guy's proposal was intriguing but difficult to test, because there are no known examples of Chinese being written in an alphabetic notation in the 15th century. The Jesuit missionaries who later developed romanization systems for Chinese did not arrive in China until the 16th century, and there is no evidence that earlier systems existed. However, Guy argued that the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence, and that it was possible that an unknown traveler or scholar had developed such a system independently. The East Asian hypothesis has never gained widespread acceptance, but it has not been definitively ruled out, and it continues to attract occasional attention from researchers. It illustrates one of the recurring themes of Voynich research, the sheer range of possibilities that remain open. Because the text cannot be read, almost any hypothesis about its language and encoding system is potentially valid, and new proposals continue to emerge regularly. Let us now turn to one of the most detailed and controversial proposals for the manuscript's origin that has emerged in recent decades. In 2011, a researcher named Stephen Bax, a professor of applied linguistics at the University of Bedfordshire in England, announced that he had made progress in deciphering the Voynich manuscript. Bax's approach was fundamentally different from most previous attempts. Rather than trying to identify the language of the text through statistical analysis and then working out the encoding system, Bax started with the illustrations. Bax reasoned that some of the plant illustrations in the herbal section might depict real, identifiable plants, and that the words or labels accompanying those illustrations might be the names of those plants. If the names could be identified, they would provide anchor points, known correspondences between specific Voynich words and specific meanings that could be used to work out the values of individual Voynich characters. This is essentially the same approach that was used to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics, where the names of pharaohs, which were known from Greek sources, provided the starting points for the decipherment. Bax claimed to have identified several plants and used the names of those plants to assign sound values to a number of Voynich characters. He then tested these values against other parts of the manuscript and found what he believed to be consistent results. His proposed readings included the names of several plants and stars that he believed were written in a Semitic or Central Asian language. Bax's work attracted considerable attention and generated intense debate. His methodology was praised by some as rigorous and innovative, and criticized by others as circular and dependent on uncertain plant identifications. The fundamental problem with Bax's approach was that the plant identifications on which his entire analysis rested were subjective and debatable. Different researchers, looking at the same illustration, could and did identify different plants, and different plant identifications led to different character values and different readings. Without independent confirmation of the plant identifications, the entire chain of reasoning was vulnerable to collapse. Bax continued to refine and expand his analysis until his untimely death in 2017. His work remains influential and is regarded by many as one of the most serious and methodologically sound attempts at partial decipherment, but it has not been accepted as a definitive solution. The question of the manuscript's language has also been approached from the direction of the illustration's cultural context. Several researchers have noted that some of the manuscript's artistic and stylistic features are consistent with the traditions of specific regions, and they have used these observations to propose geographical origins for the manuscript. One such proposal, advanced by the historian and Voynich researcher René Zandbergen, places the manuscript's origin in the northern Italian region, possibly in the area around the city of Milan or the towns of the Veneto. Zandbergen has argued that the style of the manuscript's illustrations, the format of its pages, and the specific forms of its quire numbers are all consistent with Italian manuscript production of the early 15th century. He has also identified what he believes are parallels between the Voynich manuscript and other illustrated manuscripts known to have been produced in this region during this period. Zandbergen's work on the manuscript's provenance has been widely respected, and his proposal for an Italian origin is one of the most widely accepted theories about the manuscript's geographical background. However, it does not solve the mystery of the text because there is no known Italian language or dialect that matches the properties of Voynichese, and no known Italian cipher system that could produce the observed text. Another geographical proposal that has attracted attention was put forward by Nicholas Gibbs, a British researcher who specializes in medieval manuscripts and heraldry. In 2017, Gibbs published a paper in the Times Literary Supplement claiming that he had identified the Voynich manuscript as a medieval health manual for women, specifically a guide to gynecological medicine and therapeutic bathing. Gibbs argued that the text was written in abbreviated Latin, using a system of shorthand and abbreviation that was common in medieval medical manuscripts. He proposed that each apparent word in the Voynich text was actually an abbreviation for a longer Latin word or phrase, and that the text could be read by expanding these abbreviations according to standard medieval conventions. Gibbs's proposal generated enormous media coverage and public interest, but it was quickly and sharply criticized by Voynich researchers. His proposed readings were vague and unverifiable, and his claim that the text was in abbreviated Latin was contradicted by the statistical analysis of the text, which does not match the properties of Latin, whether abbreviated or not. Most importantly, Gibbs did not provide a complete or even partial translation of the manuscript. He claimed to have identified the system by which the text should be read, but he did not demonstrate that this system actually worked by producing coherent readings of more than a few isolated passages. His proposal was widely regarded as another in the long line of announced breakthroughs that failed to survive scrutiny. The episode illustrated a recurring pattern in the history of Voynich research. A researcher announces a solution, the media amplifies the announcement, the public becomes briefly excited, and then the scholarly community dismantles the proposal, leaving the manuscript as mysterious as before. This cycle has repeated itself so many times that it has become almost a defining feature of the field. Every few years, a new solution is announced, and every few years it is debunked. But the persistence of these attempts and the intensity of public interest in each new announcement tells us something important about the Voynich manuscript's hold on the human imagination. People want this mystery to be solved. They want the silent book to speak, and they are willing to invest enormous amounts of time and energy and to endure repeated disappointments in pursuit of that goal. Let us now consider some of the more unusual and speculative theories about the manuscript's origins and purpose. While these theories are not supported by mainstream scholarship, they are worth examining because they illuminate the range of possibilities that the manuscript's impenetrability has opened up. One of the most persistent alternative theories is that the Voynich manuscript is the work of an extraterrestrial intelligence. According to this view, the manuscript was either created by beings from another world who visited Earth in the distant past, or it was created by a human being who had contact with such beings and recorded their knowledge or language. The unidentifiable plants, the bizarre illustrations, and the unreadable text are all cited as evidence that the manuscript's content originates from a non-human source. This theory has no credible evidence to support it, and it is rejected by all serious researchers. The manuscript's vellum has been dated to the 15th century and is made from the skin of terrestrial animals. The inks and pigments are made from terrestrial materials. The handwriting, while unique in its specific characters, is produced by techniques that are consistent with human writing practices of the medieval period. There is nothing about the physical artifact that requires or even suggests a non-human origin. However, the extraterrestrial theory persists in popular culture, and it reflects a genuine, if misguided, insight. The Voynich manuscript is so strange, so unlike anything else that has survived from the medieval period, that people reach for extraordinary explanations to account for its existence. The impulse to invoke alien intelligence is, in a sense, a tribute to the manuscript's uniqueness. It says, in effect, that this object is so far outside the bounds of normal human experience that only the intervention of a completely alien intelligence can explain it. A more grounded but equally speculative theory proposes that the Voynich manuscript is the product of a visionary or mystical experience. According to this view, the manuscript's creator was a mystic, a prophet, or a visionary who received the content of the manuscript through direct divine inspiration, hallucinatory experience, or some other altered state of consciousness. The unreadable text is not a cipher or a code, but rather a glossolalia text, a written form of speaking in tongues, produced in a state of religious ecstasy or trance. This theory draws on the well-documented tradition of visionary and prophetic writing in the medieval and early modern periods. Many religious figures, including Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Meister Eckhart, produced texts that they claimed were inspired by divine revelation. Some of these texts included descriptions of strange visions, unusual beings, and cosmic structures that bear a superficial resemblance to some of the images in the Voynich manuscript. The visionary theory would explain several features of the manuscript that are otherwise difficult to account for. The unidentifiable plants could be visionary plants, species that exist only in the spiritual realm. The bizarre biological illustrations could depict spiritual processes or metaphysical truths that cannot be represented in realistic terms. And the unreadable text could be a divine or angelic language that was received by the author in a state of ecstasy and transcribed without being understood. However, the visionary theory has significant weaknesses. The text of the Voynich Manuscript is far too consistent and structured to be the product of random glossolalia. As we have discussed, the text follows statistical patterns that are characteristic of organized, meaningful language. True glossolalia, as studied by linguists and psychologists, produces sequences of sounds that are much more random and much less structured than the Voynich text. If the manuscript is the product of a visionary experience, the author must have been an unusually disciplined and consistent visionary, one who produced structured text over hundreds of pages without ever breaking out of the patterns and rules of their private language. A related theory proposes that the manuscript is the product of an autistic savant or a person with some other form of neurodivergent cognition. According to this view, the manuscript's creator had a brain that processed language and visual information in a fundamentally different way from neurotypical individuals, and the manuscript represents the output of this different cognitive process. The unusual plants, the strange diagrams, and the unreadable text are all manifestations of a mind that perceived and organized reality in ways that are incomprehensible to most people. This theory is interesting as a thought experiment, but it is virtually impossible to test or verify. We have no way of knowing the cognitive profile of the manuscript's creator, and the theory does not make any specific predictions that could be confirmed or refuted by analysis of the manuscript itself. Let us set aside these more speculative theories and return to the mainstream of Voynich research, where a number of important developments have occurred in recent years. One of the most significant recent developments has been the application of multispectral imaging to the manuscript. Multispectral imaging uses light at different wavelengths, including ultraviolet and infrared, to reveal features of a manuscript that are invisible to the naked eye. Inks and pigments that have faded or been erased can sometimes be recovered using this technique, and hidden text or drawings can be revealed beneath later additions or overpainting. Multispectral imaging of the Voynich manuscript has revealed a number of interesting features. In some areas, traces of earlier drawings or guidelines can be seen beneath the visible illustrations, suggesting that the artist made preliminary sketches before producing the final drawings. In other areas, faded or erased text has been partially recovered, providing additional data for analysis. However, the multispectral imaging has not revealed any hidden key, glossary, or translation that would solve the mystery of the text. Another important recent development has been the increasing sophistication of the radiocarbon dating and materials analysis techniques applied to the manuscript. As mentioned in the first part, the vellum was dated to between 1404 and 1438 in a study published in 2009. More recent analyses have refined this dating and have also provided additional information about the inks and pigments used in the manuscript. One particularly important finding is that the ink used for the text appears to be consistent with the radiocarbon date of the vellum. While ink dating is less precise than vellum dating, the results suggest that the text was written within a few decades of the vellum's preparation, which supports the view that the manuscript was created as a single, unified document in the early 15th century rather than being written on old vellum at a later date. Analysis of the pigments has revealed that some of the colors, particularly the blue and green pigments, are consistent with materials that were commonly used in European manuscript painting during the 15th century, but that were not available in all regions. The blue pigment, in particular, appears to be derived from a mineral source that was more commonly used in certain parts of Europe than in others. This information has been used to support various proposals for the manuscript's geographical origin, though the results are not conclusive enough to identify a specific location. The question of the manuscript's intended audience is one that has received surprisingly little attention in the scholarly literature, given its potential importance. If we could determine who the manuscript was written for, we would have a much better understanding of its purpose and content. A book written for a physician would contain different information than a book written for an alchemist, a priest, or a prince. A book written for a private readership of one would be very different from a book written for circulation within a community. The fact that the manuscript is written in an unreadable script provides an important clue about its intended audience. If the text were written in Latin or another widely known language, it could be read by any educated person. The use of a private or secret script implies that the text was intended to be read only by people who knew the script, which in turn implies that the manuscript was created within a community that shared knowledge of this writing system. The existence of such a community would explain both the creation of the manuscript and the consistency and fluency of its text. The author was writing in a script that was used by a group of people, not a script that they had invented for this single document. But who were these people? Where did they live? What did they believe? And what happened to them? These are questions that the manuscript itself cannot answer and for which no external evidence has been found. The community that used this script, if it existed, has disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only this single, tantalizing artifact. Some researchers have proposed that the manuscript was created within a monastic community, perhaps one that had developed its own private script for recording sensitive or secret information. Medieval monasteries were centers of learning and literacy, and it was not uncommon for monks and nuns to develop specialized writing systems for particular purposes. The Cistercian numerals, for example, were a notational system developed by Cistercian monks for recording numbers, and the Tyrrhenian notes were a system of shorthand that was used in some monastic contexts. The monastic hypothesis would explain several features of the manuscript. Monasteries had the resources and expertise to produce illuminated manuscripts, including the vellum, inks, pigments, and artistic skills required. Monastic communities were also places where specialized knowledge, including herbal medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, was studied and recorded, and the use of a private script would be consistent with the monastic tradition of protecting sacred or sensitive knowledge from unauthorized access. However, the monastic hypothesis also has weaknesses. The illustrations in the Voynich Manuscript, particularly the nude female figures in the biological section, are unusual for a monastic context. While nude figures are not unknown in medieval religious art, their prominence in the Voynich Manuscript would be surprising in a document produced by a community that valued modesty and celibacy. Some researchers have argued that the figures are not intended to be sexually provocative and that they should be understood in the context of medieval medical or allegorical traditions, but others have found this argument unconvincing. Another proposal places the manuscript's origin in the Jewish intellectual tradition. As discussed in the first part, Jewish scholars in the medieval period were often multilingual and highly literate, with access to a rich tradition of textual production and commentary. The Kabbalah, the mystical tradition within Judaism, involved the study of hidden meanings in sacred texts and the use of numerological and symbolic systems that could potentially underlie the Voynich text. Jewish communities also had practical reasons for using private writing systems, since their correspondence and records were sometimes subject to confiscation or censorship by hostile authorities. The Jewish hypothesis is supported by several features of the manuscript. The bathing imagery in the biological section could be connected to the Jewish practice of mikveh, or ritual immersion. The astronomical diagrams could be connected to the Jewish tradition of astral magic, in which the movements of the stars and planets were believed to influence human affairs and could be manipulated through the use of specific rituals and talismans. And the herbal and pharmaceutical sections could be connected to the long tradition of Jewish medicine, which drew on both the Greek medical tradition and indigenous Jewish healing practices. However, the Jewish hypothesis is not supported by any direct evidence. No Jewish community has been identified that used a script resembling Voynich's, and no Jewish text has been found that describes or references the manuscript. The hypothesis remains speculative, though it continues to attract interest and investigation. A more recent proposal, which has generated considerable discussion in the Voynich research community, connects the manuscript to the intellectual tradition of the medieval Islamic world. According to this theory, the manuscript was created by someone who was educated in the Arabic or Persian scientific tradition, and who used a modified Arabic script or a script derived from Arabic to record knowledge that had been acquired through Islamic scholarly networks. This proposal is motivated in part by the observation that some of the manuscript's scientific content, including its herbal illustrations and astronomical diagrams, seems to reflect traditions that were more fully developed in the Islamic world than in medieval Europe. Islamic scholars made major contributions to botany, pharmacology, astronomy, and alchemy during the medieval period, and their works were widely translated and disseminated across Europe. The transmission of Islamic scientific knowledge to Europe through centers like Toledo in Spain and Salerno in Italy was one of the most important intellectual developments of the Middle Ages and played a crucial role in the eventual emergence of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. If the Voynich manuscript was created by someone who was part of this intellectual tradition, or who had access to Islamic scientific texts, this could explain both the content of the manuscript and the use of an unfamiliar script. Arabic language scientific texts were sometimes written using modified scripts or notation systems, and a scholar who was translating or adapting such a text for a non-Arabic speaking audience might have used a new script to represent the sounds or concepts of the original language. However, like all other proposals for the manuscript's origin, the Islamic hypothesis is not supported by direct evidence, and it faces significant objections. The script of the Voynich manuscript does not closely resemble Arabic or any known modified Arabic script. The artistic style of the illustrations is more European than Islamic, and the overall format and organization of the manuscript are more consistent with European bookmaking traditions than with the traditions of the Islamic world. Let us now consider the manuscript from a completely different angle, the perspective of art history. The illustrations in the Voynich manuscript, whatever they depict, are works of art, and they can be analyzed using the methods and frameworks of art historical study. Art historians who have examined the manuscript have noted several features of the illustrations that provide clues about the artist's training, influences, and cultural background. The drawing style is characterized by clear, confident outlines rendered in brown or dark ink, with color added in flat washes. The figures, whether plants, people, or celestial objects, are depicted with a combination of naturalism and stylization that is typical of late medieval and early Renaissance illustration. The nude female figures in the biological section have been compared to similar figures in other medieval manuscripts, including medical texts, astrological treatises, and alchemical works. In these contexts, nude figures were commonly used to represent the human body in relation to the zodiac, the four humors, or the stages of alchemical transformation. The Voynich figures, while unusual in their number and arrangement, are not without precedent in the broader tradition of medieval scientific illustration. The plant illustrations have been compared to the herbals of the medieval period, including the famous herbal attributed to Pseudo-Apuleius, the Codex Vindobonensis, and the later printed herbals of the 15th and 16th centuries. These comparisons have revealed both similarities and differences. The Voynich plants share the general format of medieval herbal illustrations, a single plant depicted in profile with roots, stem, leaves, and flowers clearly visible. But the specific style of the drawing, with its curving, organic lines and its tendency toward fantasy and exaggeration, is unusual and has not been closely matched to any specific regional or workshop tradition. The astronomical and cosmological diagrams have been compared to similar diagrams in medieval astronomical and astrological manuscripts, including the works of Sacrobosco, Ptolemy, and various Islamic astronomers. Some of the circular formats and zodiacal imagery are clearly derived from these traditions, but the specific details and arrangements of the Voynich diagrams are unique and have not been matched to any known source. One art historical observation that has attracted considerable attention is the apparent influence of Italian artistic traditions on the manuscript's illustrations. Several researchers have noted similarities between the Voynich illustrations and the work of Italian artists and illustrators of the early 15th century, including the use of certain decorative motifs, the treatment of architectural elements in the cosmological diagrams, and the general aesthetic sensibility of the drawings. This observation is consistent with the proposal that the manuscript was produced in Italy, and it has been used to support various Italian origin theories. However, artistic influence does not necessarily indicate geographical origin. Italian artistic traditions were widely disseminated across Europe in the 15th century, and a manuscript produced in Germany, France, or Central Europe could easily reflect Italian artistic influences without having been produced in Italy itself. The fold-out pages of the manuscript deserve particular attention from an art historical perspective. These large, complex diagrams, which require unfolding to be viewed in their entirety, represent a significant investment of time, effort, and material. They suggest that the manuscript's creator considered these diagrams to be especially important enough to devote extra space and care to their presentation. The most famous fold-out page, often called the rosette page because of its arrangement of circular forms resembling rosettes, has been the subject of extensive analysis and speculation. The page shows a series of 9 large circular forms arranged in a 3x3 grid, connected by what appear to be causeways or paths. Each circular form contains detailed imagery, including what seem to be buildings, towers, walls, and other architectural or geographical features. The overall impression is of a map or diagram of a specific place, perhaps a city, a region, or a cosmological landscape. Researchers have attempted to identify the location depicted in the rosette page by comparing its features to real-world geography. Some have proposed that it shows a group of volcanic islands, perhaps in the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. Others have suggested that it depicts a specific European city, such as Milan, Rome, or Constantinople. Still others have argued that it is a purely schematic or symbolic representation with no direct geographical reference. One intriguing proposal identifies the rosette page as a map of a real volcanic landscape, possibly in the area around the Phlegrean Fields near Naples, Italy, or on the island of Ischia. The circular forms, according to this interpretation, represent volcanic craters or calderas, and the connecting paths represent roads or waterways between them. The hot springs and geothermal features of these areas would also be consistent with the bathing imagery in the biological section, suggesting a possible connection between the two. This interpretation is attractive because it provides a coherent and internally consistent explanation for several otherwise puzzling features of the manuscript. The plants in the herbal section could be species native to the volcanic soils of southern Italy. The bathing imagery could depict the therapeutic use of hot springs, which was a well-established practice in the region. The astronomical diagrams could reflect the astrological traditions of southern Italian culture, and the pharmaceutical section could contain recipes for medicines made from local ingredients. However, this interpretation, like all others, is not proven. The identifications of specific geographical features are subjective and debatable, and the proposal has not been widely accepted by the scholarly community. Let us now return to the question of decipherment and consider whether there are any new approaches or technologies that might finally break the code of the Voynich manuscript. The most promising new tool is artificial intelligence, particularly the branch of AI known as deep learning. Deep learning systems, which use artificial neural networks with many layers to identify patterns in large data sets, have achieved remarkable results in a wide range of tasks, including image recognition, language translation, and text generation. Some researchers believe that deep learning systems, trained on large corpora of text in many languages, might be able to identify the language of the Voynich text or detect patterns that human researchers have missed. Several research teams have applied deep learning to the Voynich Manuscript in recent years. As mentioned in the first part, a team from the University of Alberta used a neural network to analyze the text and concluded that the most likely underlying language was Hebrew. Other teams have used different AI approaches and reached different conclusions. The results so far have been inconclusive, and no AI system has produced a readable translation of any substantial portion of the text. The limitations of AI in this context are worth understanding. Deep learning systems are extraordinarily powerful pattern recognition tools, but they require large amounts of training data to function effectively. The Voynich manuscript contains only about 35,000 words, which is a very small corpus by the standards of computational linguistics. Modern AI language models are typically trained on billions or even trillions of words, and their ability to identify and analyze linguistic patterns depends on having access to vast quantities of text. With only 35,000 words to work with, even the most sophisticated AI system is severely limited in what it can learn about the structure and language of the Voynich text. Furthermore, AI systems work by finding patterns that match patterns in their training data. If the Voynich text is written in a language or encoding system that is not represented in the AI's training data, the system will be unable to identify it. This is particularly relevant if the Voynich text is written in an extinct language, an artificial language, or an unusual cipher that has no parallel in the system's training data. In such cases, the AI might identify a superficial statistical resemblance to a known language without that resemblance being meaningful. Despite these limitations, AI remains one of the most promising avenues for future research. As AI technology continues to advance and as larger and more diverse training datasets become available, the ability of these systems to analyze the Voynich text will improve. It is conceivable that a future AI system, trained on a much larger and more diverse corpus of historical texts, might be able to identify patterns in the Voynich text that current systems cannot detect. Another promising avenue of research involves the use of advanced imaging technologies to study the physical manuscript in greater detail. Techniques such as X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, which can identify the elemental composition of inks and pigments without damaging the manuscript, and high-resolution three-dimensional scanning, which can capture the surface texture and topography of the vellum at microscopic scales, could potentially reveal new information about the manuscript's materials, production techniques, and history. For example, X-ray fluorescence analysis might reveal that the inks used in different sections of the manuscript have different chemical compositions, which could provide evidence about whether the text was written all at once or over an extended period, by one scribe or by several. Three-dimensional scanning might reveal the sequence in which strokes were made, providing information about the ductus or handwriting style of the scribe that could help to identify the cultural and geographical context in which the scribe was trained. These technologies are already available and have been applied to other medieval manuscripts with impressive results. Their application to the Voynich manuscript would require the cooperation of the Voynich library and the use of sophisticated and expensive equipment, but it is technically feasible and could potentially yield important new insights. The possibility that the Voynich manuscript might be decoded through a chance discovery of external evidence should also be considered. History is full of examples of mysteries that were solved not through the analysis of the mysterious object itself, but through the discovery of related documents or artifacts that provided the missing context. The Rosetta Stone, which enabled the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics, was discovered by chance during a military campaign in Egypt. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which revolutionized our understanding of Second Temple Judaism, were found by a shepherd in a cave. The Linear B tablets, which revealed the existence of Greek-speaking civilization in the Bronze Age, were excavated from the ruins of an ancient palace. It is possible that somewhere in the world, in an unexamined archive, an uncatalogued collection, or an undiscovered cache, there exists a document that provides the key to the Voynich Manuscript. This document might be a translation of the manuscript, a key to its cipher, a letter from its creator explaining its purpose, or a related text in the same script that includes enough context to enable decipherment. Such a discovery, if it ever occurs, would be one of the most sensational finds in the history of scholarship. The likelihood of such a discovery is impossible to estimate. The world's archives and libraries contain billions of documents, many of which have never been fully cataloged or studied. Medieval manuscripts are particularly likely to contain hidden treasures because many collections have changed hands multiple times over the centuries, and their contents are often poorly documented. The Voynich Manuscript itself was discovered in just such a collection, hidden among other manuscripts in a Jesuit library that was being quietly sold off to raise funds. It is entirely possible that related documents exist in similar collections, waiting to be found. Let us now consider the psychological and cultural dimensions of the Voynich Manuscript mystery. Why does this particular unsolved puzzle exert such a powerful hold on the human imagination? And what does our fascination with it tell us about ourselves? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the puzzle. The Voynich Manuscript is not an abstract mathematical problem or a purely technical challenge. It is a physical object, a thing of beauty and mystery that can be seen and touched and held. Its pages are filled with images that are simultaneously familiar and alien, plants that look almost but not quite like real plants, diagrams that resemble but do not match known astronomical charts, figures that engage in activities that are tantalizingly almost comprehensible. This combination of the familiar and the strange creates a powerful cognitive tension, a sense that understanding is just around the corner, just beyond the edge of perception, if only we could look a little harder, think a little more clearly, or approach the problem from a slightly different angle. This cognitive tension is deeply compelling, and it is the same psychological mechanism that drives people to solve jigsaw puzzles, crossword puzzles, and murder mysteries. The human brain is wired to seek patterns and to impose meaning on ambiguous stimuli. When confronted with something that looks as though it should be meaningful, but that resists interpretation, the brain becomes intensely engaged, allocating more and more cognitive resources to the task of making sense of the stimulus. This engagement can become addictive, leading to the kind of obsessive behavior that characterizes many Voynich researchers, who spend years or decades working on the manuscript at the expense of their careers, relationships, and mental health. The Voynich Manuscript has driven people mad, not literally perhaps, but certainly figuratively. There are researchers who have devoted their entire adult lives to the manuscript, sacrificing everything else in pursuit of its secrets. There are researchers who have become so convinced of their own solutions that they have refused to accept criticism or engage with alternative theories, retreating into isolated certainty. There are researchers who have published elaborate and beautiful but ultimately unsupported theories, only to see them demolished by their peers, and who have responded with bitterness, anger, and accusations of conspiracy. This pattern of obsession and frustration is not unique to the Voynich Manuscript. It is a common feature of all great unsolved puzzles, from the search for the perpetual motion machine to the quest for a proof of the Riemann hypothesis. But the Voynich Manuscript, with its combination of visual beauty, historical mystery, and linguistic impenetrability, seems to be particularly adept at capturing and holding the human imagination. The cultural significance of the Voynich Manuscript extends beyond the world of academic research. The manuscript has become a cultural icon, a symbol of the mysterious and the unknown. It has been featured in novels, films, television shows, video games, and works of art. It has inspired musicians, poets, and visual artists. It has been referenced in popular culture countless times, usually as a shorthand for something that is fundamentally unknowable or incomprehensible. The manuscript's cultural significance is amplified by the fact that it is a real object with a real history. Unlike fictional puzzles such as the riddle of the Sphinx or the mystery of Atlantis, the Voynich Manuscript is a tangible artifact that can be examined, analyzed, and debated. Its mystery is not the product of myth or legend, but of empirical reality. The text is there on the page waiting to be read. The plants are there waiting to be identified. The diagrams are there waiting to be understood. The solution, if it exists, is not hidden in some inaccessible realm, but is embedded in the physical substance of the manuscript itself. This tangibility gives the Voynich Manuscript a unique power. It is not a story about a mystery. It is the mystery itself, incarnated in vellum and ink. And as long as the mystery endures, the manuscript will continue to fascinate, frustrate, and inspire. Let us take a moment to consider what the world would look like if the Voynich Manuscript were finally deciphered. What would we expect to find? If the manuscript is a genuine medical or pharmaceutical text, we might find a catalog of herbal remedies and therapeutic procedures, some of which might be already known from other sources, and some of which might be new to science. Medieval herbal medicine, while often dismissed as folk superstition, has been shown in many cases to be based on genuine pharmacological properties of plants. Several modern drugs, including aspirin, digitalis, and quinine, were originally derived from plants that were used in traditional medicine for centuries before their active compounds were identified and synthesized. A new source of medieval pharmaceutical knowledge could potentially lead to the discovery of new compounds with therapeutic value. If the manuscript is an alchemical text, we might find a description of the theory and practice of alchemy as understood by a specific 15th century practitioner or school. While alchemy is no longer practiced as a serious science, it played an important role in the development of modern chemistry, and new alchemical texts can provide valuable insights into the history of scientific thought and the intellectual culture of the medieval period. If the manuscript is a mystical or religious text, we might find a description of spiritual practices, beliefs, or experiences that are otherwise unknown. Such a discovery could shed light on the diversity of religious thought in the medieval period and might reveal the existence of a spiritual tradition that has been completely lost. If the manuscript is an astronomical or astrological text, we might find a description of celestial observations, calendrical systems, or astrological doctrines that differ from the mainstream traditions that have survived in the historical record. Such a discovery could provide new data about the history of astronomy and the development of astronomical techniques in the medieval period. And if the manuscript is a hoax, we would learn nothing about medicine, alchemy, mysticism, or astronomy, but we would learn a great deal about the art of deception and the psychology of belief. A successful medieval hoax that has fooled experts for more than a century would be a remarkable achievement in its own right, and understanding how it was done could provide valuable insights into the mechanisms of fraud and gullibility. In any of these scenarios, the decipherment of the Voynich Manuscript would be a major event in the history of scholarship. It would make headlines around the world, generate enormous public interest, and launch a new era of research into the manuscript's contents and context. It would also bring a sense of closure to the generations of researchers who have devoted their lives to the pursuit of its secrets. But would it also bring a sense of loss? There is something appealing about a mystery that has no solution, a puzzle that can never be completed, a question that can never be answered. The Voynich Manuscript, in its current undeciphered state, is a canvas onto which anyone can project their own ideas, theories, and fantasies. It is all things to all people, a medical text, an alchemical treatise, a mystical revelation, an alien artifact, a medieval prank. Once it is deciphered, it will become one thing, and all of the other possibilities will vanish. The mystery, which has sustained the manuscript's fame and fascination for more than a century, will be gone. Perhaps this is why some people secretly hope that the manuscript will never be deciphered. Not because they do not want to know what it says, but because they value the mystery itself, the sense of wonder and possibility that comes from confronting something truly unknown. In a world where information is abundant and answers are just a search query away, the Voynich Manuscript is a rare and precious thing, a genuine enigma, a place where the known world ends and the unknown begins. But for those who are driven by the desire to understand, who cannot rest while a puzzle remains unsolved, who believe that every mystery has a solution and that human ingenuity can overcome any obstacle, the Voynich Manuscript is not a treasure to be preserved in its mysterious state, but a challenge to be met and overcome. For these people, the manuscript is not valuable because it is unreadable. It is valuable because it waits to be read. And they will continue to work, to analyze, to hypothesize, and to test, until either the solution is found or the last researcher gives up and the manuscript returns to its solitary silence. The history of scholarship is full of problems that seemed insoluble until they were solved. For centuries, no one could read Egyptian hieroglyphics. For decades, no one could crack the Enigma cipher. For generations, no one could understand the structure of DNA. In each case, the breakthrough came not through a single flash of insight, but through the accumulation of knowledge, the development of new tools, and the persistent effort of dedicated individuals who refused to accept that the problem was beyond their reach. The Voynich Manuscript may yet yield to this same process. The knowledge accumulated by a century of research, the tools provided by modern technology, and the effort of the global research community may combine someday to produce the breakthrough that has eluded everyone who has come before. Or the breakthrough may never come, and the manuscript may remain undeciphered forever, a monument to the limits of human understanding. We do not know which of these outcomes will prevail. But we do know that the Voynich Manuscript has enriched human culture immeasurably, not in spite of its mystery, but because of it. It has inspired countless people to learn about linguistics, cryptography, medieval history, botany, and the art of manuscript production. It has brought together communities of researchers from diverse backgrounds and disciplines, united by their shared fascination with a single artifact. It has generated a vast body of scholarship that, even if it has not solved the central mystery, has advanced our understanding of many related fields. And it has reminded us again and again that the world is a stranger and more wonderful place than we sometimes allow ourselves to believe. The Voynich Manuscript is more than a book. It is a mirror reflecting our own desires, our own limitations, and our own relentless curiosity. It is a challenge daring us to look deeper, think harder, and imagine more boldly. And it is a promise whispering across the centuries that somewhere hidden in its pages there is a truth that we have not yet found, a voice that we have not yet heard, a story that we have not yet read. The manuscript sits in its case at the Voynich Library, its pages softened by time, its colors gently faded, its secrets intact. Outside the library, the world rushes on, busy with its own concerns, its own crises, its own discoveries. But inside the case, time stands still. The plants still grow in their impossible forms. The women still bathe in their pools of green water. The stars still turn in their mysterious orbits. And the text still flows across the page, line after line, page after page, in a script that no one has ever read and that perhaps no one will ever read. Or perhaps someday someone will. Perhaps the next person who looks at the manuscript, really looks at it, with fresh eyes and an open mind, will see something that everyone else has missed. Perhaps a new technique, a new algorithm, a new approach will reveal the pattern that has been hiding in plain sight for 500 years. Perhaps a chance discovery in an archive, a library, or a private collection will provide the missing piece that makes everything else fall into place. Until that day comes, the Voynich Manuscript will continue to do what it has always done. It will wait. It will wait with the patience of vellum and ink, with the quiet persistence of something that has outlasted empires, survived catastrophes, and endured the relentless probing of the brightest minds in human history without surrendering a single one of its secrets. It is the book that no one can read. And it is perhaps the most human object in the world because it embodies the very essence of what it means to be human, to seek, to wonder, to reach for understanding, and to confront with humility and awe the vast ocean of what we do not know. There is one final thought that deserves our attention before we close this exploration. The Voynich Manuscript challenges a fundamental assumption that underlies much of modern thought, the assumption that all knowledge is, in principle, accessible. We live in an age of unprecedented information. The sum of human knowledge is available at the touch of a screen. Languages are translated instantly by algorithms. Ancient scripts are deciphered by scholars with access to vast databases and powerful computing tools. We have sent probes to the outer reaches of the solar system, mapped the human genome, and photographed black holes at the centers of galaxies. And yet this small, quiet book, sitting in its glass case, resists us. It looks at us with its painted eyes and its curling script, and it says nothing. It offers us no foothold, no handhold, no starting point. It is a wall of silence, smooth and featureless, against which all of our tools and techniques have been thrown in vain. This is not a failure of modern science or scholarship. It is a reminder of the vastness and diversity of human experience. The person who created the Voynich Manuscript lived in a world that was, in many ways, profoundly different from our own. They thought in ways that we may not be able to reconstruct. They used systems of knowledge that may have no parallel in our own intellectual tradition. They may have spoken a language that has left no other trace in the historical record. They may have been part of a community that has been entirely forgotten. The Voynich Manuscript is a message from this forgotten world. It is a voice from the past, speaking in a language that we have lost the ability to hear. And yet the voice is still there, preserved in the fibers of the vellum and the pigments of the ink, waiting for someone to listen. Perhaps that someone is you. Perhaps among the millions of people who will see this story and hear about this manuscript, there is one person who will be seized by the same fascination that has gripped so many before them. One person who will dedicate themselves to the pursuit of the manuscript's secrets with the same passion and determination that has characterized the best of the Voynich researchers. Perhaps that person will bring a new perspective, a new approach, a new insight that will finally crack the code. Or perhaps the manuscript will remain forever silent, a beautiful enigma at the heart of human knowledge, a reminder that some doors once closed cannot be reopened. Either way, the Voynich Manuscript has already achieved something remarkable. It has survived for more than 500 years. It has inspired generations of scholars, scientists, and dreamers. It has expanded the boundaries of what we consider possible. And it has reminded us in the most vivid and unforgettable way that the world is full of wonders that we have not yet begun to understand. The book that no one can read has spoken, after all. Not in words that we can understand, not in a language that we can translate, but in the universal language of mystery, beauty, and the unquenchable human desire to know. And in that language it has told us everything we need to hear. The pages close, the glass case is sealed. The climate control hums softly in the background, and in the silence of the Voynich library the Voynich Manuscript rests, patient and eternal, holding its secrets close, waiting for the reader who has not yet been born or who has not yet realized that the answer has been there all along, hidden in plain sight on pages that have been waiting for centuries to be understood. This concludes our exploration of the Voynich Manuscript, the most mysterious document in the history of the world. Whether you believe it is a genuine text, a brilliant hoax, a mystical vision, or something else entirely, one thing is certain. It will continue to captivate, challenge, and inspire for as long as there are human beings who are drawn to the unknown. The book that no one can read will endure, and so will the question that it asks silently from every one of its 240 pages. Can you read me? The answer, for now, remains the same as it has always been. Not yet, but perhaps someday. Somewhere inside the fortified walls of Yale University's Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library, behind layers of climate-controlled glass and under the watchful gaze of security systems designed to protect some of the most valuable written artifacts in human history, there sits a small, unassuming book. It is roughly 9 inches tall, 6 inches wide, and just over an inch thick. Its vellum pages are worn and soft, their edges rounded by centuries of handling. Its cover, a simple and unremarkable binding, gives no indication of what lies within. If you were walking through the library and did not know what you were looking at, you might pass right by it. You might mistake it for any number of medieval texts that fill the shelves of great libraries across Europe and beyond. You might assume it was a book of prayers, a medical treatise, a farmer's almanac, or a monk's diary. You would have no reason to stop, no reason to look twice. But this book is none of those things, or perhaps it is all of them. No one knows, no one has ever known. And despite more than a century of sustained effort by some of the most brilliant minds humanity has ever produced, including world-class linguists, military codebreakers who cracked enemy ciphers in the deadliest wars the world has ever seen, computer scientists armed with artificial intelligence algorithms capable of processing billions of data points per second, historians, botanists, astronomers, and obsessive amateur sleuths who have devoted their entire adult lives to this single puzzle, no one has ever been able to read a single confirmed word of this book. It is known as the Voynich Manuscript, and it is, without exaggeration, the most mysterious document in the history of the written word. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. This is not a story about a dusty old book. This is a story about the very nature of knowledge, about the boundaries of human understanding, about whether there exist ideas and systems of thought so foreign to our modern minds that we cannot even begin to comprehend them. It is a story about obsession, about deception, about the tantalizing possibility that somewhere in the distant past, someone created something so profoundly unusual that 500 years of human progress have not been enough to unlock its secrets. The Voynich Manuscript is catalogued as MS 408 at the Voynich Library. It contains approximately 240 pages, though scholars believe that some pages have been lost over the centuries. Every single page is filled with text, written in an elegant, flowing script that resembles no known alphabet in any language, living or dead. The letters, if that is even the correct word for them, are graceful and consistent, written with the confidence and fluidity of someone who clearly knew what they were writing, someone who had practiced this script many times before. There are no obvious corrections. There are no crossed-out words. There are no signs of hesitation or uncertainty in the hand of the writer. Whoever wrote this book did so with purpose and conviction, but the text is only part of the mystery. The Voynich Manuscript is lavishly illustrated with hundreds of drawings that are, to put it mildly, deeply strange. There are plants that do not exist in any known botanical catalogue. There are astronomical diagrams that seem to depict the movements of celestial bodies, but correspond to no recognized system of astronomy. There are drawings of naked women bathing in pools of green liquid connected by elaborate networks of tubes and pipes. There are circular diagrams covered in symbols and divided into segments in ways that suggest zodiacal or calendrical systems, but match nothing that any historian has ever been able to identify with certainty. There are what appear to be pharmaceutical recipes, with drawings of roots and herbs alongside blocks of the same unreadable text. The images are colorful, often bizarre, and rendered in a style that is simultaneously primitive and sophisticated. Some scholars have described them as the work of a gifted amateur, someone with a clear artistic vision but limited formal training. Others have argued that the crudeness of the illustrations is deliberate, that they are stylized representations of real things drawn in a way that was meant to obscure their true identity. Still others have suggested that the images depict things that simply do not exist in our world, things imagined, hallucinated, or imported from a reality that we cannot access. For more than 100 years, the Voynich Manuscript has resisted every attempt at decipherment. It has broken the minds and hearts of brilliant people. It has spawned thousands of theories, ranging from the plausible to the absurd. It has been called the Holy Grail of cryptography, the most studied and least understood document in existence, and the single greatest unsolved mystery in the history of linguistics. Some have declared it a meaningless hoax, an elaborate medieval prank designed to fool a wealthy buyer into paying a fortune for a book full of gibberish. Others have argued that it contains genuine knowledge, perhaps alchemical secrets, lost herbal remedies, or spiritual insights recorded in a language that was deliberately made impenetrable to protect its contents from the uninitiated. And then there are those who believe that the Voynich Manuscript is something else entirely, something that our current frameworks of understanding are simply not equipped to explain. Something that suggests the existence of knowledge systems, perhaps even civilizations, that have been completely erased from the historical record. Something that might, if it could ever be read, fundamentally change our understanding of what human beings knew and were capable of centuries before the modern era. To understand the Voynich Manuscript, we must first understand how it came to the attention of the modern world. And that story begins, as so many stories of great discoveries do, with a man who was searching for something valuable in a place where most people would never think to look. His name was Wilfrid Michael Voynich. He was born in 1865 in a town called Telšiai, which was then part of the Russian Empire and is now located in modern-day Lithuania. Voynich was a remarkable figure by any measure. As a young man, he became involved in revolutionary politics, opposing the rule of the Russian Tsar. He was arrested and imprisoned in Warsaw, and later escaped and made his way across Europe, eventually settling in London, where he reinvented himself as a rare book dealer. He married Ethel Lillian Boole, the daughter of the famous mathematician George Boole, whose work on logic and binary systems would later become foundational to computer science. Ethel herself was a novelist and political activist, and the couple moved in intellectual circles that included some of the most prominent thinkers and writers of their era. Wilfrid Voynich had an extraordinary eye for rare and valuable manuscripts. He traveled extensively, visiting monasteries, private collections, and estate sales across Europe, always searching for forgotten treasures. He understood that the greatest finds were often hiding in plain sight, buried in collections that their owners did not fully understand or appreciate. He knew that a single overlooked manuscript, correctly identified and authenticated, could be worth a fortune. In 1912, Voynich made the discovery that would define his legacy and attach his name permanently to one of history's greatest mysteries. He was visiting the Villa Mondragon, a grand Renaissance estate near the town of Frascati, just outside Rome in what is now the Italian Republic. The villa was being used as a Jesuit college, and the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, was in financial difficulty. To raise funds, the Jesuits were quietly selling off portions of their vast library, a collection that had been assembled over centuries and included manuscripts and books of enormous historical significance. Voynich was allowed to examine a collection of manuscripts that had been set aside for potential sale. Among them, he found a small, thick volume with a worn vellum cover. When he opened it, he encountered page after page of text written in a script he had never seen before, accompanied by illustrations unlike anything in his considerable experience with medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. He was immediately captivated. He knew, with the instincts of a man who had spent decades handling rare documents, that he was looking at something truly extraordinary. Voynich purchased the manuscript, along with several other items from the Jesuit collection. The exact price he paid has never been conclusively established, and Voynich himself was deliberately vague about the details of the acquisition, perhaps to protect the Jesuits from criticism for selling valuable holdings, perhaps to maintain his own competitive advantage as a dealer who had discovered something that others had overlooked. Voynich brought the manuscript back to his shop and began trying to learn everything he could about it. Tucked inside the front cover, he found a letter that would become the earliest concrete clue about the manuscript's provenance. The letter was written in Latin, dated 1665 or 1666, and was from a man named Johannes Marcus Marci to a Jesuit scholar named Athanasius Kircher in Rome. Marci was the rector of the University of Prague and a respected physician and scientist. Kircher was one of the most famous intellectuals in Europe, a polymath who studied everything from magnetism and optics to Egyptology and music. He was particularly well known for his attempts to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics, and although his translations were later shown to be largely incorrect, his reputation as a decoder of ancient scripts was formidable during his lifetime. In the letter, Marci explained that he was sending the manuscript to Kircher in the hope that Kircher might be able to read it, since, as Marci wrote, no one else had been able to do so. Marci mentioned that the manuscript had previously been owned by Georg Bersch, a little-known alchemist who had lived in Prague and who had spent years trying and failing to decipher the book. Bersch had also written to Kircher about the manuscript, sending him copies of some of the text and images and asking for help. There is no evidence that Kircher ever replied to Bersch or made any progress with the manuscript. After Bersch died, the manuscript passed to Marci, who then sent it to Kircher. The letter also contained one additional tantalizing detail. Marci wrote that, according to a source he considered reliable, the manuscript had once been purchased by the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II for the enormous sum of 600 ducats. Rudolph II ruled from 1576 to 1612 and was famous for his passionate interest in science, alchemy, astrology, and the occult. His court in Prague was a magnet for scholars, artists, alchemists, and charlatans from across Europe. If the manuscript truly passed through Rudolph's hands, this would place it firmly in the world of late Renaissance intellectual culture, and would suggest that even in the 16th century, the book was already considered mysterious and valuable enough to command a price that was equivalent to several years' income for a skilled craftsman. Marci also mentioned in his letter that the manuscript was believed to have been the work of Roger Bacon, the famous English friar, philosopher, and early advocate of the scientific method who lived in the 13th century. Bacon was known for his wide-ranging intellectual interests, including optics, alchemy, and linguistics. He had also reportedly created or experimented with ciphers and codes.